Hey guys, tonight we're sailing through time on a Phoenician ship. Picture it now, the salty breeze against your face, the steady creak of the wooden hull beneath you, and that unmistakable scent of cedar filling the air. You've just stepped onto a vessel that will take you across vast seas to lands unknown. The Phoenicians, those legendary traders of the ancient Mediterranean, didn't just rule the waves, they did it with a secret weapon that's almost too strange to believe. The power of smell. You probably won't survive this trip without a deep appreciation for how much scent shaped the ancient world. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Oh, and leave a comment about where you're tuning in from and what time it is where you are. It's always fun to see where our journey takes us. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself aboard a Phoenician trading ship, and you're not alone. Around you, seasoned sailors haul crates of precious goods, whispering about far-off lands. These are the same sailors who, in the 9th century BCE, helped lay the groundwork for one of the most influential trading empires the world has ever known. But here's the kicker. They did it, in part, by mastering something we often overlook today. Smell. Not just the kind of smell you get from fresh sea air, but the kind that whets the appetite, appeals to the senses, and keeps people coming back for more. You've likely heard of perfume, right? Well, what if I told you that the Phoenicians were one of the first cultures to use scents as a commodity in international trade? They were so good at it, in fact, that their ships were known to be floating markets of fragrance, as well as carriers of fine luxury items. The Phoenicians didn't just trade with their neighbors. They reached out to distant lands, connecting Africa, Asia, and Europe. But how? Well, scent was an integral part of this long-distance trade, and the perfume and incense they traded were as valuable as gold and silver to ancient civilizations. But before we dive into the specifics of how scent became such a valuable commodity, let's first explore the Phoenicians' mysterious beginnings. Born in the region we now call Lebanon, their homeland was made up of city-states like Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos. These cities, perched along the eastern Mediterranean coast, were essentially natural trading hubs, surrounded by sea, and blessed with abundant natural resources like timber, metals, and, of course, aromatic plants. The Phoenicians had one big advantage: seafaring skills. While other civilizations were still figuring out how to navigate the seas, the Phoenicians had already mastered shipbuilding and navigation. Their ships, known for their speed and agility, could travel vast distances. They could sail from their homeland in the Levant, venture across the Mediterranean, and trade with civilizations as far away as ancient Egypt, Greece, and even as far west as modern-day Spain. But what made their ships so effective? Well, let's talk about the secret ingredient: wood. You see, the Phoenicians had access to the most prized timber of all, cedar wood. These towering trees, native to the mountains of Lebanon, were highly aromatic and prized for their durability. Phoenician ships were constructed from cedar, which meant that every voyage was, quite literally, a journey through a fragrant forest. It wasn't just about the beauty or strength of the wood. It was the smell. The fragrance of cedar was known to be pleasing and even medicinal, and it quickly became associated with luxury and power. Imagine the scent filling the air as these ships moved across the waters, a subtle yet constant reminder of the Phoenician dominance over sea trade. But let's get back to the trade of scent itself. The Phoenicians didn't just use cedar wood for their ships. They also traded the wood for its aromatic properties. Cedar wood was highly valued not only for construction, but also for its use in perfumes, incense, and cosmetics. The Phoenicians were one of the first to extract these fragrances and introduce them to the wider Mediterranean world. They recognized that the scents they harvested could be just as profitable as the goods they traded for. Historians still argue whether the Phoenicians were the first to use scent as a major economic asset, or if it was a gradual evolution within their society. One thing is for sure, the Phoenicians didn't just use scent to enhance their goods. They created an entire market around it. The incense they produced was burned in temples temples across the ancient world, and the perfumes they crafted were used by royalty and the wealthy to demonstrate their status. Let's take a quick detour and talk about how the Phoenicians achieved this. One of their greatest innovations was the creation of perfume as we know it today. They would crush flowers, herbs, and spices to extract their oils, and then mix them with other substances like animal fats and oils to create long-lasting fragrances. Perfume wasn't just for smelling nice, though. It was often associated with spiritual or religious rituals. The act of burning incense or wearing perfume became an essential part of the ancient world's social fabric. It was, in many ways, a status symbol. The Phoenicians made sure to capitalize on this. They built markets and trading routes specifically for their scented goods. Ships laden with perfumes and incense would travel along their established trade routes, stopping at major cities like Carthage and Alexandria. The scent of their goods would fill the air long before their ships docked in port, enticing merchants and customers alike. This ability to trade with the senses was one of the keys to their success as global traders. So, now you're probably wondering, how did this all lead to the establishment of an empire? The Phoenicians didn't just trade locally. They spread out across the Mediterranean, establishing colonies wherever there was demand for their goods. The most famous of these colonies was Carthage, which would go on to rival Rome for control of the Mediterranean. Carthage's success was built on the same principles of trade that the Phoenicians had pioneered, and they continued to use scents, especially incense, as a primary trading product. As we slowly wind down this first section of our journey, remember, the Phoenicians didn't just sail to faraway lands. They took the essence of their world with them. The scent of cedar, the fragrance of flowers, and the aroma of incense were not just commodities. They were a way of life, a reflection of the Phoenician worldview. Every journey was a fragrant one, and with every trade, they not only exchanged goods, they exchanged the very smells of their culture. You're still sailing, the scent of cedar and salt water filling your senses. The sun is high, and as you look out over the horizon, your eyes catch a glimpse of the distant lands the Phoenicians once traded with. It's not just about the ships and the goods. It's about the people and the strategies that propelled these daring traders into an empire. The Phoenicians were more than just merchants. They were clever diplomats, skilled negotiators, and pioneers in the world of long-distance trade. So, let's take a moment to appreciate how this all began. The Phoenicians didn't wake up one day and decide to conquer the seas. Their rise to maritime supremacy was a process that began with necessity. Their homeland in the Levant, today known as Lebanon, didn't offer much fertile land for agriculture, but what it did offer was a prime location for trade. Between the mountains and the sea, the Phoenicians were perfectly positioned to control the trade routes of the Mediterranean. At the heart of this burgeoning trade empire was the city of Tyre, the Phoenician capital, and one of the most influential cities in ancient history. Tyre was a fortress, both literally and metaphorically. Its walls protected the inhabitants from invaders, and its strategic position on the Mediterranean coast made it the perfect hub for trade. Tyre became known for its ability to produce luxury goods, like the famous purple dye made from murex snails, and also for its ability to dominate sea trade. But Tyre wasn't the only Phoenician city-state involved in trade. Sidon, Byblos, and other cities contributed to the Phoenician network of commerce, making the whole region a dynamic powerhouse of trade, culture, and innovation. And as the Phoenicians began to establish themselves as dominant traders, they realized that their trading networks were only as strong as their relationships with others. This is where their diplomatic savvy came into play. The Phoenicians were masters of building alliances. They didn't conquer lands by force, well, not usually. Instead, they relied on their ability to trade and forge partnerships with other civilizations. They were the ultimate middlemen, facilitating the exchange of goods from Egypt, Greece, and beyond, and bringing them to distant parts of the world. They knew how to use their maritime skills and their vast trading networks to become indispensable to the ancient world. Historians still argue whether the Phoenicians were simply opportunists who capitalized on the favorable conditions of their geography, or if they were true pioneers who shaped the course of Mediterranean history through their innovative trade practices. Some believe their wealth and influence came from their ability to trade with such diverse cultures, while others argue that the Phoenicians were deeply strategic in how they built and maintained their empire. Either way, one thing is clear. The Phoenicians were able to leverage their maritime dominance to become central figures in the Mediterranean's political and economic life. You might be wondering, how did the Phoenicians manage to maintain their power for so long? It wasn't just about having the best ships or the most luxurious goods. It was about their ability to adapt, innovate, and, crucially, their skill in creating trade monopolies. They didn't just trade anything. They focused on high-demand goods, especially those that couldn't be easily sourced elsewhere. The purple dye, for example, became so associated with Phoenician trade that it was called Tyrian purple. This was a product that no one else could produce in the same way, and because it was so rare, it fetched a high price, making it a key element of Phoenician wealth. But the Phoenicians didn't stop there. They knew that trading wasn't just about raw materials or finished goods. It was about creating something that people wanted and were willing to pay a premium for. That's where the smell factor came back in. The Phoenicians knew how to make their goods irresistible. Imagine a merchant from Egypt, for example, walking through the bustling markets of Tyre. The smell of incense, the rich scent of cedar, and the faint whiff of perfumes would greet him long before he saw the actual goods. It's no wonder that Phoenician traders had such a hold on the luxury market of the ancient world. The Phoenician approach to trade wasn't just based on product quality. It was an immersive experience. You could walk through the Phoenician marketplace and feel the energy, hear the chatter, see the vibrancy of colors, and, most notably, smell the air filled with exotic fragrances. This sensory overload created a lasting impression, making Phoenician goods highly coveted and reinforcing their reputation as the kings of trade. And let's not forget about the Phoenician ships. These weren't just floating markets of luxury, they were marvels of ancient engineering. The Phoenicians perfected the art of shipbuilding, and their vessels were fast, maneuverable, and able to withstand the challenges of long voyages. The ship's holds were specially designed to carry goods like scented oils, wine, and other precious cargo. These ships became synonymous with efficiency and reliability, allowing the Phoenicians to dominate the Mediterranean for centuries. Historians continue to debate the specifics of Phoenician shipbuilding techniques. Some argue that the Phoenicians were the true inventors of the bireme, a type of ship with 2 rows of oars, while others suggest they simply perfected existing designs. Regardless, the Phoenicians were masters of their craft, creating ships that were unrivaled in their day. Their ships allowed them to carry not just goods, but also the reputation of their people. As you sit back and reflect on the Phoenician trade empire, one thing becomes clear. It wasn't just about ships and goods. It was about the way the Phoenicians used their environment to their advantage. From the cedar forests of Lebanon to the bustling marketplaces of Tyre, everything in their world had a purpose. Their ships carried the scent of their homeland across the seas, and their markets were a sensory experience designed to captivate and convince. In many ways, they were the first to understand the full power of smell in commerce, and it played a significant role in their ability to build an empire. The air on the ship is still thick with the smell of cedar, but now, as you look toward the horizon, you realize something important. This isn't just about sailing or trading. It's about the power of these seemingly small things. The smells, the sounds, the sights that tie the Phoenician world together. The more you look, the more you see how deeply embedded this culture of trade is within the daily lives of the people who made it happen. Their empire wasn't just built on goods. It was also built on experiences, and those experiences, often overlooked today, revolved around something very simple, yet extraordinarily powerful: scent. But before we dive too deep into the nuances of Phoenician trade culture, let's take a step back and consider the far-reaching implications of their work. The Phoenicians were the world's first great seafarers and traders to establish such an interconnected web of commerce, And it wasn't just about trading objects. They were literally trading ideas, innovations, and cultural practices through their trade routes. The Phoenicians became the ultimate cultural brokers, acting as the bridge between the ancient East and West. One of the most significant ways they did this was by spreading innovations like their writing system. While we tend to think of the Phoenicians mainly for their trade, their alphabet, the ancestor of the Greek and Latin alphabets, was arguably their greatest cultural gift to the world. Before the Phoenicians, ancient writing systems were cumbersome and complex, often reliant on pictographs or cuneiform. The Phoenicians simplified writing to the alphabet we now use every day, making it easier for traders, scribes, and diplomats to communicate across vast distances. Historians still argue whether the Phoenicians developed the alphabet independently or whether they borrowed elements from earlier systems like those in Egypt. Either way, the Phoenician alphabet was a game changer. It was not only easier to learn, but also incredibly adaptable to different languages. This means that their trading partners, from the Egyptians to the Greeks, could quickly pick it up, and the written word became another way for the Phoenicians to facilitate their economic and diplomatic connections. Let's shift gears for a moment. Imagine being an ancient Phoenician merchant standing in the bustling market of Carthage, one of the most powerful Phoenician colonies. You've traveled across the Mediterranean, bringing with you fine textiles, rare spices, and luxurious perfumes. The air smells of incense, myrrh, and exotic flowers. Your goods are already enticing the buyers. But this is more than just selling products. It's about creating a brand. Phoenician merchants knew how to sell a lifestyle, not just goods. Their products weren't just about utility. They were about making a statement. Wearing Phoenician perfume or draping oneself in Phoenician textiles wasn't just a way to smell good or look fashionable. It was a way to declare your status. The use of scent was essential in establishing this brand. When you think about luxury today, you probably think about high-end fashion houses or expensive perfumes. Now, imagine those concepts applied to the ancient world, and you can begin to understand how the Phoenicians used smell to establish their empire. Just like today's luxury goods, Phoenician products were associated with wealth, sophistication, and exclusivity. The fact that only a select few could afford their rare perfumes and luxurious textiles gave these products an air of mystery and desirability, drawing in customers from all over the Mediterranean. Let's not forget about the Phoenicians' knack for innovation in trade practices. Unlike the land-based traders of the ancient world, the Phoenicians had the sea as their highway. This allowed them to carry goods faster, more efficiently, and with a wider reach than any of their competitors. Their ships didn't just carry goods. They carried ideas, cultures, and even people across vast distances. One of the key reasons for their success was the way they integrated local resources into their trade practices. They didn't just import or export goods. They adapted to local demands and created a highly efficient system of supply and demand. For example, in Egypt, the Phoenicians traded cedar for gold and papyrus, and in exchange, the Egyptians received valuable goods like their famous glassware, textiles, and of course, the perfumes that the Phoenicians had mastered. Historians still argue over the extent of the Phoenician influence in the development of Mediterranean trade networks. Some argue that the Phoenicians were the first true globalizers, setting the stage for the later empires like Rome and Greece. Others suggest that their influence has been overstated, and that much of their success was due to their ability to capitalize on existing trade networks, rather than create new ones. Regardless of where historians land on this debate, the fact remains that the Phoenicians helped establish a trading network that linked the ancient world in ways that had never been seen before. The Phoenicians also established colonies in places like North Africa, Spain, and Sicily, ensuring that their trade empire was not just confined to their homeland. These colonies played an essential role in spreading Phoenician culture and trade practices to new regions, allowing them to maintain dominance in the Mediterranean for centuries. They didn't just trade goods, they planted the seeds for cultural exchange, with every colony contributing to the growth and expansion of Phoenician trade. As you sit back and take in the enormity of the Phoenician Empire, it's important to remember that the influence of scent was everywhere. From the perfumes they sold to the incense burned in temples, the Phoenicians understood how deeply scent could influence people's desires and behaviors. It was, in many ways, their secret weapon, a tool for making their goods irresistible, building their brand, and ensuring their dominance as the ultimate traders of the ancient world. And as you look back out across the Mediterranean, you can almost smell the salt water and incense blending in the breeze, a reminder of just how deeply scent was woven into the fabric of Phoenician life. As the sun starts to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows over the deck of the Phoenician ship, you're reminded of the far-reaching impact of these ancient traders. You've heard about their goods, their ships, and their strategic prowess, but there's something else that made the Phoenicians stand out from the rest of the ancient world. Their deep understanding of how to create desire through what can only be described as the art of scent marketing. While you're staring out into the vast expanse of the Mediterranean, think for a moment about how the Phoenicians used not just goods, but their environment to shape their success. The scents of the Mediterranean were an essential part of their empire building. It wasn't just the smell of their luxurious textiles or incense. It was how they made their ships and cities feel like gateways to a world of riches and indulgence. They knew that the sensory experience of trade could captivate an audience long before the goods were even seen. But what about the practicalities? After all, the Phoenicians were first and foremost traders, and their success wasn't just based on artistic or luxury goods. It was also rooted in their business acumen. They were able to establish trade routes that not only brought them profit, but helped them connect with distant civilizations in ways no one else had. The Phoenician approach to trade wasn't just a local endeavor, it was a global one. They traded across the vast Mediterranean, reaching the Egyptian, Greek, and Roman civilizations, and even venturing as far west as modern-day Spain and beyond. You might be surprised to learn that the Phoenicians weren't the only ones in the Mediterranean engaged in trade. In fact, many ancient civilizations were participating in a vibrant exchange of goods, ideas, and culture. However, what set the Phoenicians apart was their ability to dominate these trade routes. While other cultures might have traded with a few neighboring nations, the Phoenicians expanded their reach into far-flung territories, and they did this with remarkable consistency and precision. Their ships were the most advanced of their time, equipped with sails and oars, allowing them to cover vast distances. They could travel from the Levant to the shores of Africa or the distant coast of Europe with relative ease. Historians still debate whether the Phoenicians were more successful in trade because of their ships or their business strategies. Some argue that their ships were the primary reason for their dominance, as their speed and maneuverability allowed them to beat other ships to market. Others believe that their real success lay in their ability to build relationships and alliances with foreign powers, allowing them to monopolize certain goods like purple dye and cedar wood. Both aspects undoubtedly played a role, but it's safe to say that without their well-organized trading networks, the Phoenicians wouldn't have been able to conquer the Mediterranean as they did. This network wasn't just about trade, though. It was also about communication. The Phoenicians were masters of diplomacy, and much of their success can be attributed to their ability to negotiate favorable terms with the various cultures they encountered. They weren't conquerors or empire builders in the traditional sense. They didn't expand through force. Instead, they expanded through mutual cooperation and exchange. This diplomacy allowed them to set up colonies and trading outposts all over the Mediterranean. From Carthage in North Africa to the island of Sicily, and even as far as the Iberian Peninsula, these colonies became central points in the Phoenician network, ensuring that goods could flow smoothly across the Mediterranean, making Phoenician trade the lifeblood of the ancient world. But what made these colonies so successful? You might wonder. Well, part of it was the Phoenicians' ability to blend into the cultures they encountered. They didn't just import their own goods and ideas. They adopted elements of the local culture and integrated them into their own. This cultural flexibility allowed the Phoenicians to create harmonious relationships with the people they encountered, which in turn fostered a more peaceful and prosperous trade environment. This cultural exchange also helped to spread Phoenician influence, creating a legacy that would last far beyond their reign. As you continue your journey across the seas with the Phoenicians, it's important to realize how much they valued knowledge. They were incredibly astute in how they kept track of their business ventures. Phoenician merchants were known to have kept detailed records of their transactions, which allowed them to maintain a high level of organization and efficiency. This attention to detail was essential in a world where trade was largely dependent on oral agreements and face-to-face transactions. The Phoenicians understood that, to be successful in business, one had to keep track of not only the goods, but the relationships that made those goods flow. They were, in many ways, the first great accountants of the ancient world. Historians still argue whether the Phoenicians were the first to develop the concept of a written business contract, or whether they borrowed the idea from other ancient cultures. Some scholars point to the clay tablets and inscriptions found in Phoenician cities as evidence of their early use of written agreements, while others suggest that their oral tradition was sufficient to maintain their business operations. Whatever the case, the Phoenicians were undoubtedly pioneers in creating a sophisticated system of trade that was both efficient and reliable. It's also worth noting that the Phoenicians didn't just trade goods, they traded knowledge. Their ships were floating hubs of innovation, and their voyages helped spread technological advancements across the Mediterranean. They shared their knowledge of shipbuilding, navigation, and even metalworking with other cultures, enriching the civilizations they interacted with. The Phoenician legacy is thus not only one of trade, but also one of intellectual exchange. Their impact on ancient societies was profound, and their contributions helped shape the future of the Mediterranean world. As the stars begin to twinkle above you, you realize how much the Phoenicians relied on the natural world. From the scent of the cedar trees to the winds that carried their ships, everything in their world seemed to have a purpose. Even their cities were designed with the flow of trade in mind, strategically positioned to take advantage of natural resources and favorable winds. The Phoenicians knew how to harness their environment, turning it into an empire built on the power of nature, trade, and, of course, the subtle art of scent. The air grows cooler as you make your way deeper into the Phoenician world. You can almost feel the pulse of trade underfoot, the bustling markets, the rhythmic noise of merchants negotiating, and the constant flow of goods from one hand to another. It's easy to get lost in the noise and energy of it all, but if you focus for just a moment, you'll realize something that set the Phoenicians apart from the rest of the ancient world: their ability to combine business with sensory experiences that tantalized the imagination. Take a deep breath, though, not just to enjoy the fresh sea breeze, but to take in the overwhelming scent of opportunity. The Phoenicians were masters of scent, and their perfumes weren't just an afterthought. They were an essential part of their cultural and commercial success. Imagine walking through a Phoenician port, and as the ship docks, you're immediately greeted by the overwhelming smell of incense, lavender, and myrrh. It's as though you're walking into a sensory wonderland, a place where luxury and trade meet in the most fragrant way possible. And this wasn't just about creating a pleasant atmosphere. It was about creating a brand. This sensory branding, if you will, was crucial to the Phoenician approach to empire building. Historians still debate whether the Phoenicians' success came from their cultural dominance or from their trading ingenuity. Some believe it was the sheer volume of goods they produced and traded that allowed them to thrive. Others argue that it was their ability to carve out a niche in the luxury market that made them so influential. What's clear, however, is that the Phoenicians understood the power of smell in a way that was ahead of their time. Their use of scent didn't just serve to enhance the experience of trading, it served to elevate their goods to a level of prestige that was unmatched in the ancient world. Take, for instance, the famous Tyrian purple dye. This rich, royal color was not only created from the rare murex shell, but was also infused with the unmistakable scent of the sea. To wear Tyrian purple was to wear power. The Phoenicians didn't just sell fabric dyed in this precious color. They sold an experience, an aura of exclusivity that made their goods incredibly desirable. And it wasn't just the rich and powerful who sought out these luxurious items. Merchants from all over the Mediterranean traveled to Phoenician cities in search of these fragrant, high-end products. You might be wondering, how exactly did the Phoenicians manage to get such a foothold in the luxury goods market? Well, it wasn't just about having a monopoly on certain goods. It was about how they built relationships with other civilizations, and how they strategically marketed their products. They knew that once they captured the imagination of foreign markets, their goods would sell themselves. The Phoenicians didn't just sell materials, they sold an experience of affluence, of exoticism, and of wealth. They used their knowledge of fragrance to set their goods apart in a crowded marketplace. In a way, the Phoenicians were the original luxury brand creators. Imagine their markets, with the heady scents of incense and perfume in the air, the colorful fabrics hanging on display, and the sight of merchants haggling over the price of precious commodities. The Phoenician merchants knew that people bought not just out of need, but out of desire. And that desire was carefully cultivated through their marketing of luxury goods, scents, and the prestige that came with owning Phoenician products. But it wasn't just their goods that were designed to entice. The very layout of Phoenician cities was intended to make people feel as though they were entering a world of wealth and luxury. From the moment you stepped into one of their bustling ports, you were immersed in a sensory experience that made you want to buy whatever they were selling. The scents, the colors, the sounds, all of it worked together to create an unforgettable experience. For the Phoenicians, it wasn't enough to simply have good products. They knew that creating an experience would make their goods irresistible. And let's not forget about the importance of the Phoenician alphabet, another one of their incredible contributions to the world. The invention of a simple alphabet, based on consonants, revolutionized written communication. It made trade easier, faster, and more efficient. Merchants could now quickly record transactions, sign agreements, and communicate with other cultures without the need for complex scripts or symbols. This innovation helped the Phoenicians maintain their edge in trade, enabling them to connect with distant civilizations in ways that would have been impossible otherwise. Historians still argue over how the Phoenician alphabet influenced the development of other writing systems. While it's clear that the Phoenicians had a huge impact on the Greeks, many scholars debate whether the Greeks adopted the Phoenician script directly or whether they independently developed their own writing system. Regardless of the details, one thing is clear: the Phoenicians' contribution to writing helped lay the foundation for modern languages and trade practices. Their alphabet was not only a practical tool for communication, it was a tool that allowed the Phoenicians to extend their influence across the Mediterranean. In a way, the Phoenicians' success was not just based on the goods they traded, but on their ability to control the flow of information, making their systems of trade more efficient and widespread. Their alphabet helped streamline the exchange of goods, making it easier for them to maintain their network of trade routes and colonies. And just like the scent of their perfumes, their influence spread far and wide, becoming woven into the fabric of Mediterranean life. As you sit back and reflect on the journey of the Phoenicians, you realize that what made their empire so successful wasn't just their ships or their goods. It was their ability to create an experience. They mastered the art of making people want what they had, and they did so with a combination of strategy, innovation, and a deep understanding of human desire. Their use of scent, their mastery of luxury goods, and their clever communication systems helped them create an empire that would last for centuries. And while their ships may have sailed off into history, the legacy of their influence can still be felt today in the way we market and experience products. As the stars begin to twinkle over the Phoenician ship, you start to realize something deeper. The Phoenicians were not just traders. They were artists, tacticians, and innovators, blending commerce with culture in a way that was far ahead of its time. Their empire was not built on conquests or territorial expansions, but on a carefully crafted network of relationships, trust, and, as you might expect by now, an almost uncanny mastery of sensory experiences. You might be wondering, how did the Phoenicians manage to weave so many threads together? How did they create such a vast network that spanned from the shores of the Levant to the coasts of Spain and North Africa? It wasn't just their ships or their luxury goods. It was their ability to control the flow of information and the exchange of ideas, which gave them an edge over any of their competitors. They understood that knowledge was as valuable as any commodity they traded. The Phoenician alphabet, one of their most lasting contributions to civilization, played a huge role in this. As we've already touched on, the Phoenicians were responsible for simplifying writing into an alphabetic system that could be easily adopted by other cultures. This wasn't just a practical tool for communication. It was a way for them to build trust with far-off lands. By using a common system of writing, they were able to create more efficient trade agreements, mark ownership of goods, and even record debts, all of which made their empire function like a well-oiled machine. Historians still debate whether the Phoenicians truly invented the alphabet, or merely adapted it from earlier systems like those of the Egyptians. Some scholars argue that they borrowed heavily from Egyptian hieroglyphs, while others believe the Phoenician alphabet was an entirely original creation. The truth may lie somewhere in between, but one thing is certain. The Phoenician alphabet revolutionized the way the ancient world did business, and its influence can still be seen in the alphabets we use today. But while the alphabet was essential for communication, it wasn't the only tool the Phoenicians used to maintain their dominance. Their trade routes were meticulously mapped out, stretching from their cities along the coast of the Levant to as far west as the Iberian Peninsula, to the south into Africa, and north into Greece and Italy. These trade routes were the arteries of the Phoenician Empire, and every merchant, sailor, and trader was a vital part of this vast network. What's fascinating about the Phoenicians is that they didn't just rely on a single route or product. They had multiple avenues of trade, each one with its own set of goods and services that were highly sought after in different parts of the ancient world. For example, their cities like Tyre and Sidon were famous for their textile production, especially the famous purple-dyed fabrics made from murex snails. These textiles were prized by royalty and the wealthy for their rich color and the status they conveyed. But the Phoenicians didn't stop there. They also traded glass, precious metals, timber, and a variety of luxury items that were in demand across the Mediterranean. One of the more surprising aspects of Phoenician trade was their involvement in the glassmaking industry. While glassware may not be the first thing that comes to mind when thinking about ancient trade, the Phoenicians were pioneers in this area. They developed techniques for creating glass that allowed them to produce intricate jewelry, decorative items, and even early forms of glass containers. These glass objects became highly valued in the ancient world, and the Phoenicians were able to monopolize this industry by controlling the trade of glass-making materials like sand and soda. Historians still argue whether the Phoenicians were the first to invent glass-making or whether they learned it from other cultures, like the Egyptians or Mesopotamians. Some believe that the Phoenicians refined the techniques they borrowed, while others assert that they developed their own unique methods. Regardless of the origin, the Phoenicians' innovation in glass production gave them yet another commodity that set them apart from other traders. Their ability to innovate wasn't limited to luxury goods either. The Phoenicians were also highly skilled in shipbuilding, and their ships were some of the most advanced of their time. These ships were designed not only to carry goods across long distances, but also to withstand the harsh conditions of the Mediterranean. They were made with durability in mind, which was essential for the long voyages they embarked upon. Their ships were fast, agile, and capable of navigating through even the most challenging waters. One of the key reasons for their success in shipbuilding was their use of a technique known as mortise and tenon construction. This method allowed them to create ships with tightly fitting joints that could withstand the rough seas without falling apart. The Phoenicians were also among the first to use sails and oars together, which made their ships incredibly efficient and versatile. These advancements in shipbuilding allowed them to reach distant lands and establish trade networks that spanned continents. But it wasn't just about the physical aspects of trade. The Phoenicians were also masters of diplomacy. They understood that in order to maintain their trade empire, they had to cultivate relationships with other powerful nations. They didn't conquer lands through military might. Instead, they forged alliances, established colonies, and set up trading posts in key locations. These alliances allowed them to secure favorable trade deals and ensure the safety of their ships as they sailed the Mediterranean. Historians still argue whether the Phoenicians were primarily driven by a desire for wealth and power, or whether they genuinely sought to build lasting relationships with other cultures. Some believe the Phoenicians were ruthless opportunists, while others argue that they were more interested in cultural exchange and mutual benefit. Regardless of their motivations, one thing is clear: the Phoenicians were able to create a lasting empire by mastering both the art of trade and the art of diplomacy. As you sit back and reflect on the legacy of the Phoenicians, it becomes clear that their success wasn't just due to their trading abilities. It was due to their ability to innovate, adapt, and build relationships. Their empire was a product of their keen understanding of human desires, their mastery of the seas, and their ability to make their goods, and their experience irresistible. The Phoenicians were more than just traders. They were architects of an empire that transcended borders and left an indelible mark on history. As the night deepens, and the stars now fully blanket the sky, you can't help but marvel at the vastness of the Phoenician Empire. You've heard about their ships, their trade, and the extraordinary influence they wielded over the Mediterranean. But there's something even more remarkable about their success: their ability to adapt and thrive in an ever-changing world. The Phoenicians didn't just trade goods, they traded cultures, ideas, and technologies that shaped the ancient world in ways that are still felt today. Picture the bustling markets of ancient Carthage, one of the Phoenicians' greatest colonies. As a prime example of this influence, the air here is filled with the aroma of spices, incense, and perfumes, a familiar scent that seems to follow you wherever you go. Merchants from all corners of the Mediterranean come here to buy Phoenician goods, from the coveted purple-dyed textiles to the intricate glassware that became a symbol of wealth and luxury. It's not just about the goods, though. The experience of the Phoenician marketplace is something more. It's an entire sensory journey that captivates the buyers, drawing them into a world where every item seems infused with the promise of something exotic and rare. This immersive experience was by design. The Phoenicians understood that trading wasn't just about exchanging material goods. It was about creating an environment that appealed to the senses, a place where buyers could imagine themselves owning a piece of the luxurious world the Phoenicians so carefully crafted. The use of scent, color, and texture in their markets was a deliberate effort to enhance the desirability of their goods, creating an aura of exclusivity around every transaction. The marketplace wasn't just a space for commerce. It was a place of culture, status, and indulgence. But while their sensory approach to trade was undoubtedly effective, the Phoenicians also understood the importance of intellectual capital. They weren't just selling products, they were sharing knowledge. The Phoenicians were known for their technological innovations, many of which were directly tied to their success in trade and shipbuilding. Their advanced ship designs, which included innovations like the bireme, a two-rowed ship, gave them a clear advantage in navigating the Mediterranean. But it wasn't just the ships themselves. It was the entire system of navigation that the Phoenicians had perfected. Historians still debate the specifics of Phoenician navigation techniques. Some argue that they were the first to use the North Star for navigation, while others believe they used a more rudimentary form of navigation based on landmarks and the position of the sun. What is clear, however, is that the Phoenicians were expert navigators who could sail long distances across the open sea without getting lost. Their knowledge of the stars, the winds, and the currents allowed them to establish trade routes that spanned thousands of miles, connecting civilizations across Europe, Africa, and Asia beyond their ships. The Phoenicians also made significant contributions to the fields of metallurgy and glassmaking. They were among the first to master the art of glass blowing, allowing them to produce delicate glass objects that became highly prized throughout the Mediterranean. Their glassware, which ranged from decorative beads to intricate vessels, became a symbol of wealth and luxury. Phoenician glassblowers even perfected the technique of creating transparent glass, a feat that was ahead of its time and was admired by civilizations far and wide. Historians still argue whether the Phoenicians were the sole inventors of glassblowing, or whether they borrowed this technique from the Egyptians or Mesopotamians. Some scholars suggest that glassmaking was a widespread practice in the ancient world, while others contend that the Phoenicians were the true innovators of this art. Regardless of the origins, the Phoenicians' ability to manipulate glass and metal for decorative and functional purposes was a major factor in their economic success. Their products became coveted treasures that were exchanged as far away as Egypt and Greece. It's also worth noting that the Phoenicians were early pioneers in the art of urban planning. Their cities, such as Tyre and Sidon, were designed with trade in mind. They built their cities near the coast, making them easily accessible by sea. This strategic placement allowed them to control the flow of goods and establish strong commercial ties with other Mediterranean civilizations. The Phoenician approach to urban planning was so effective that many of their cities became thriving commercial hubs, attracting traders from all over the ancient world. But despite all their technological advancements, it wasn't just the Phoenicians' goods or knowledge that made them so influential. It was their ability to form lasting alliances. The Phoenicians were not conquerors. They didn't go to war to expand their empire. Instead, they built their influence through diplomacy and trade. Their strategic alliances with powerful civilizations like Egypt, Israel, and later Carthage helped to ensure their dominance over the Mediterranean. Through these alliances, the Phoenicians were able to secure valuable trade routes, protect their cities from invasion, and maintain their status as the foremost trading power in the ancient world. Historians still debate whether the Phoenicians were true diplomats or simply opportunists who capitalized on the changing political landscape of the Mediterranean. Some scholars argue that they were masters of diplomacy, skillfully navigating alliances and rivalries to their advantage. Others suggest that the Phoenicians were primarily focused on expanding their trade networks, and that diplomacy was simply a tool for achieving economic success. Regardless of the interpretation, one thing is clear: the Phoenicians understood the value of relationships, and they used their diplomatic skills to build a vast network of trade and influence that spanned continents. As you reflect on the Phoenician Empire, it becomes evident that their success wasn't just based on their goods, their ships, or their innovations. It was based on their ability to adapt, innovate, and connect with other cultures. The Phoenicians may have started as a small coastal people, but through their mastery of trade, technology, and diplomacy, they became one of the most influential civilizations of the ancient world. Their legacy can still be felt today, not just in the products they left behind, but in the very systems of trade, communication, and innovation that continue to shape our world. As the calm night stretches on, you reflect on the breadth of Phoenician achievements, But there's still more to uncover. As vast as their empire was, one question continues to linger in the air. What made the Phoenicians so enduring? How did a group of merchants, spread across city-states like Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos, manage to dominate the Mediterranean for centuries, influencing everything from trade practices to cultural exchange? The answer, you quickly realize, lies not only in their ability to adapt and innovate, but in their near-perfect balance of practicality and artistry. The Phoenicians weren't just traders. They were cultural architects. They understood that success was not only about the exchange of material goods, but about the exchange of ideas. Every port they established, every colony they founded, became a melting pot of cultures. As merchants and diplomats, they brought the best of what each culture had to offer and shared their own innovations in return. This kind of cross-cultural exchange helped shape the development of the entire Mediterranean world, influencing the art, religion, and even the technology of those they came into contact with. One of the most fascinating aspects of Phoenician trade was their reliance on the Mediterranean's natural environment. It's easy to assume that their dominance came solely from their technological innovations or their naval prowess, but in reality, it was their deep connection with the Mediterranean's natural resources that allowed them to thrive. From the forests of Lebanon to the shores of North Africa, the Phoenicians knew how to harness the wealth of nature, turning it into products that were in high demand across the ancient world. And they didn't just rely on resources from their own land, they adapted and integrated resources from other regions, creating a trade system that was as diverse as the Mediterranean itself. For instance, in addition to their famous purple dye, Phoenician cities were hubs of other industries. They became famous for their glass-making and textile production, often using materials from distant lands to create items that could not be replicated anywhere else. Phoenician glass, in particular, was highly prized. They didn't just make simple glass objects, they created intricate works of art. Glass beads, jewelry, and other decorative pieces were highly sought after, and the Phoenicians became known as some of the best glassmakers in the ancient world. This level of craftsmanship elevated their goods beyond mere commodities. They became status symbols, reserved for the elite of the ancient world. Historians still debate whether the Phoenicians were the first true glassmakers of antiquity, with some suggesting they learned from the Egyptians, and others proposing they invented the technique on their own. Regardless of their origins, the Phoenicians became synonymous with exquisite craftsmanship. Their glass-making techniques would be passed down to future civilizations, influencing the development of glass-making in places like Rome and later Venice. But what about the most elusive aspect of Phoenician trade? Their colonies. The Phoenicians didn't just settle along the coastlines for the sake of trade. They understood that colonization was essential to maintaining their dominance in the Mediterranean. Cities like Carthage, established by the Phoenicians in the 9th century BCE, became key outposts in their commercial empire. Carthage would eventually grow into a powerful city-state in its own right, rivaling Rome for control of the Mediterranean, and all of it built upon the foundations laid by the Phoenician merchants. Historians still argue whether the Phoenicians intentionally set out to create these powerful colonies, or whether they simply intended to establish trading posts that grew into full-fledged cities over time. Some scholars believe that the Phoenicians saw their colonies as a way to spread their culture and maintain influence over vast regions, while others argue that they were simply looking for profitable trading routes. One thing is clear: the Phoenician colonies, like Carthage, eventually became independent centers of power, and their impact on history cannot be overstated. What's interesting about Carthage, in particular, is that it represents the complexity of Phoenician colonialism. The city was founded as a trading post, but eventually grew into a military power. While the Phoenicians were initially traders and diplomats, their colonies, especially Carthage, would go on to challenge other powers, such as the Romans, for control of the Mediterranean. The wars between Carthage and Rome, Most famously, the Punic Wars were some of the bloodiest and most significant conflicts of the ancient world. They would determine the fate of the Mediterranean and shape the future of Western civilization. But before the Romans and their inevitable rise to power, the Phoenicians ruled the Mediterranean's trade routes. They were kings and queens of the sea, controlling an empire that stretched from the shores of modern-day Lebanon to the coasts of Spain. Their ships were legendary, their products coveted, and their networks extensive. Their cities were the centers of commerce, culture, and diplomacy, where traders from across the world would meet, exchange ideas, and make deals. The Phoenicians were not conquerors in the traditional sense, but their empire was no less powerful for it. They spread their culture, innovations, and goods across vast distances, leaving behind a legacy that would influence generations to come. They taught the world the power of commerce, the importance of innovation, and the art of diplomacy. And while their empire may have eventually fallen to the Romans, the Phoenician legacy still lingers, shaping the modern world in ways we often overlook. Historians still debate the final reasons behind the Phoenicians' decline. Was it their inability to adapt to the changing political landscape of the Mediterranean? Or was it their involvement in the Punic Wars with Rome? Some suggest that their strategic alliances with other civilizations failed them, while others argue that their military weakness ultimately led to their downfall. Either way, one thing is clear: the Phoenicians' influence on trade, culture, and history cannot be denied. As you continue on this journey through the Phoenician world, it becomes evident that their story is not just about trade. It's about resilience, innovation, and the art of survival. From their ships to their colonies, the Phoenicians changed the world in ways that still resonate today. Their empire may have crumbled, but their legacy, built on scent, trade, and innovation, will forever linger in the Mediterranean air. As the night deepens, you find yourself contemplating the enduring legacy of the Phoenicians. The seas are still, and the stars twinkle brightly above you, much like they did for Phoenician sailors centuries ago. But the more you reflect, the clearer it becomes that their empire was built on far more than just trade and innovation. It was built on the power of their adaptability. The Phoenicians didn't just shape the ancient world. They shaped how we think about commerce, exploration, and even the very ways in which cultures interact. By now, you're probably starting to realize just how much the Phoenicians' influence has endured. Their ships, their perfumes, and their glassware weren't just luxury items. They were symbols of a culture that understood the importance of expanding horizons, building relationships, and thinking long-term. They didn't just settle for being good at what they did. They set out to be the best, mastering the art of diplomacy and becoming the architects of an interconnected world. In their time, the Phoenicians were the undisputed kings of the Mediterranean. They not only brought goods from the East, but also exchanged ideas with civilizations from across the ancient world. They traded stories, technologies, and cultural practices, weaving a vast web of influence that reached from Egypt to Greece, and from Spain to the shores of Africa. They weren't just traders, they were cultural messengers, carrying the knowledge and customs of one civilization to another. They gave the world their alphabet, their maritime technologies, and their sophisticated understanding of commerce and trade. But perhaps their greatest legacy is the fact that they knew how to make their empire irresistible. Let's go back to the markets of ancient Phoenician cities like Tyre, Sidon, and Carthage. Imagine walking through these bustling hubs of commerce, where the air is filled with the scents of perfumes, the sounds of merchants haggling, and the colorful displays of textiles and goods. These markets were more than just places to buy and sell. They were experiences. A trip to a Phoenician market wasn't just about acquiring goods. It was about being immersed in a sensory feast, and this, more than anything, was part of the Phoenician genius. They understood that people don't just buy products, they buy feelings, experiences, and stories. And the story the Phoenicians were selling was one of luxury, power, and exclusivity. Historians still argue whether the Phoenicians truly invented the concept of luxury branding, or whether they simply capitalized on existing markets. Some scholars suggest that the Phoenicians were simply opportunistic traders, exploiting the demand for high-end goods in the ancient world. Others argue that they were the original luxury marketers, creating a brand that became synonymous with wealth and sophistication. Regardless of where historians stand on this debate, one thing is clear. The Phoenicians understood how to create demand, how to craft an aura of exclusivity, and how to make their goods irresistible. But let's pause for a moment to appreciate just how far-reaching the Phoenician Empire truly was. The Phoenicians didn't just dominate the Mediterranean. They were instrumental in shaping the ancient world's understanding of global trade. They established colonies across North Africa and Europe, including in places like Sicily, Sardinia, and Spain, and their trade routes stretched as far as Britain. They were the first true global traders, connecting disparate civilizations through commerce, diplomacy, and culture. Their cities became melting pots of ideas and goods, where knowledge, technology, and innovations from across the world converged. The Phoenician Empire, however, was never static. They were continually evolving, expanding, and adapting to changing circumstances. When their trading networks were threatened by new powers, like the Greeks and Romans, they didn't rely solely on military might. Instead, they adapted. The Phoenicians understood the importance of cultural exchange, and were quick to assimilate aspects of the cultures with which they traded. This flexibility allowed them to thrive in an ever-changing political landscape. They didn't fight wars for territory. They fought for influence and trade, and in the end, that strategy paid off. Their diplomatic skills allowed them to maintain power and influence long after their political empires had fallen. Yet, despite their dominance, the Phoenicians eventually found themselves eclipsed by the rise of the Roman Empire. The Romans were, in many ways, the inheritors of Phoenician trade and culture. They adopted the Phoenician alphabet, learned from their shipbuilding techniques, and absorbed much of their knowledge of commerce. The Romans were able to build upon these foundations and create an empire that spanned much of Europe, North Africa, and the Near East. Historians still debate the extent of Phoenician influence on Roman society. Some argue that the Romans simply borrowed from the Phoenicians and didn't fully understand or appreciate the true genius of Phoenician trade. Others suggest that the Romans consciously built on the foundations laid by the Phoenicians, using their knowledge to create an even more sophisticated empire. Whatever the case may be, it's undeniable that the Phoenicians were ahead of their time. They were the first to realize the importance of establishing far-reaching trade routes, not just for wealth, but for the exchange of ideas, technologies, and cultures. The legacy of their innovation, diplomacy, and cultural exchange shaped the course of history long after their fall. As you continue to sail with the Phoenicians through the calm waters of history, it becomes increasingly clear that they were more than just a group of traders. They were pioneers of a new world order. They didn't just create an empire of goods. They created a world of interconnectedness, cultural exchange, and collaboration. The Phoenicians may have faded into history, but their influence continues to shape the way we think about trade, communication, and even the luxury goods market today. They were the first to understand the power of branding, the importance of sensory experiences, and the art of adaptation. As the winds calm and the journey draws to a close, you're left with the realization that the Phoenician story isn't just one of ancient trade. It's a timeless story of ingenuity, resilience, and innovation. From their ships to their markets, from their goods to their influence, the Phoenicians showed the world that success isn't just about what you trade. It's about how you create a lasting impression. And in that, they succeeded more than anyone could have imagined. As the sea calms, and the last vestiges of daylight fade into the dark, you can feel the weight of history. The Phoenicians, once the dominant traders of the ancient world, may seem distant now, their ships lost to time, but their influence lingers in ways that are impossible to ignore. Every venture, every trade route, every piece of glass and textile they crafted contributed to a foundation that would shape the course of civilizations for millennia. The question of how they achieved this, how they balanced trade with cultural exchange, luxury with practicality, is one that still fascinates historians. One thing is clear: the Phoenicians' success wasn't based on brute force or military might. It was their ability to forge relationships, adapt to changing circumstances, and, crucially, their deep understanding of what it meant to build an empire. Not just with physical land, but with influence. They didn't conquer through wars. They conquered through commerce, culture, and subtle diplomacy. Imagine once more being in one of their bustling cities, perhaps Carthage, where Phoenician traders and foreign merchants intermingle, sharing goods, ideas, and experiences. The market is alive with activity, the air thick with the scent of incense, perfumes, and the salty tang of the sea. You can hear the chatter of merchants from Egypt, Greece, and even as far as the British Isles, exchanging goods, knowledge, and stories. The Phoenicians were brilliant at this, creating an atmosphere where commerce wasn't just about goods, but about connection. The cities they founded were hubs of trade, but they were also cultural centers. Every Phoenician city, from Tyre to Carthage, wasn't just about economic dominance. It was about creating a place where different cultures met, ideas exchanged, and new innovations were born. It was in these places that technologies like glass-blowing, which the Phoenicians are often credited with advancing, flourished. Glass wasn't just a luxury item, it was a medium through which culture was shared, a tangible representation of Phoenician craftsmanship and ingenuity. But it wasn't just the raw materials that defined Phoenician trade. It was how they made the exchange of goods a sensory experience. You could see the colors of their textiles, hear the sounds of merchants haggling, and most importantly, you could smell the air thick with spices, perfumes, and burning incense. The Phoenicians weren't just selling products. They were selling an entire way of life, an experience wrapped up in the fragrant, vibrant world they created. Historians still argue whether the Phoenicians were the first true global traders or whether their influence was exaggerated. Some scholars suggest that the Phoenicians simply capitalized on existing trade routes that were already being used by other civilizations. Others argue that the Phoenicians were pioneers in building the infrastructure for long-distance trade that we would recognize today. Either way, one thing is certain: the Phoenicians set the stage for the interconnected world we live in today, where the exchange of goods, culture, and ideas is more important than ever. While much of the Phoenician Empire eventually fell to the Romans, their legacy endured. The Romans adopted many aspects of Phoenician culture, from their alphabet to their trade practices, and expanded upon them. In fact, much of what we think of as Roman culture, their reliance on written language, their use of glass and other luxury goods, and their wide-reaching trade networks, has its roots in Phoenician innovations. The Phoenicians may not have conquered the world in the way the Romans did, but they laid the groundwork for everything that followed. As you drift further into the night, it's clear that the Phoenician story is not just one of ancient history. It's a story that continues to shape our modern world. The practices they pioneered in trade, the technologies they introduced, and the way they used sensory experiences to build their empire have left a lasting mark on everything from global commerce to branding and marketing. In many ways, the Phoenicians were the first to understand the psychology of consumerism. Long before the term was even coined, they knew that it wasn't enough to simply have a good product. You had to create an experience around it, a story that would make people want to buy and buy again. You might be wondering what happened to the Phoenicians in the end. Their cities, their ships, and their goods eventually became part of the greater Roman Empire, and their influence began to fade as new powers rose to prominence. Carthage, the jewel of Phoenician colonization, was famously destroyed by Rome in the Third Punic War, and much of Phoenician culture was absorbed into Roman civilization. But despite their political fall, the Phoenicians' legacy lived on in the foundations they laid for global trade, communication, and cultural exchange. Historians continue to debate the exact reasons for the Phoenician decline. Was it due to the rise of Rome, their inability to adapt to new political realities, or their gradual assimilation into other cultures? Some argue that the Phoenicians' decline was inevitable, given their relatively small land base and lack of military power. Others suggest that their reliance on trade and diplomacy, rather than military conquest, ultimately led to their vulnerability. Regardless of the cause, the Phoenician story is a testament to the power of commerce, culture, and innovation in shaping the course of history. As you prepare to wrap up this journey through Phoenician history, remember that their empire was not built on war or conquest, but on trade, diplomacy, and the mastery of the senses. The Phoenicians were the world's first true global traders, and their legacy continues to influence how we think about commerce, culture, and branding today. Their ships may have sailed into history, but the marks they left on the world are still felt in every trade agreement, every cultural exchange, and every luxury item that captures the imagination. As the waves gently rock the Phoenician ship, you begin to understand the true depth of their legacy. The night is quiet now, but as you close your eyes, you can almost hear the creaking of ancient ships and the bustling of Phoenician markets. The world they inhabited may have been a different one, but their influence continues to echo through the centuries. The Phoenicians didn't just shape the ancient Mediterranean, they helped lay the groundwork for the interconnected global world we live in today. You can imagine what it must have been like to be a Phoenician merchant, standing at the helm of your ship as it sailed toward distant lands. The wind in your hair, the scent of the sea and cedarwood all around you, and the promise of wealth and discovery just beyond the horizon. These were the adventurers of the ancient world, not just traders of goods, but navigators of the unknown, building connections that spanned continents. But what drove the Phoenicians to venture so far from home, establishing colonies and trading networks across the Mediterranean and beyond? It wasn't just the pursuit of wealth, it was an innate curiosity, an understanding that to truly thrive, they had to go beyond their shores and create a network of influence. The Phoenicians were explorers, and in their pursuit of trade, they discovered more than new lands. They discovered new ways of connecting people and cultures. Historians still argue whether the Phoenicians' expansive empire was driven more by economic motives or by a genuine desire to explore and learn from other civilizations. Some believe that their trading routes were purely profit-driven, while others suggest that the Phoenicians were motivated by an intellectual curiosity, eager to learn from the cultures they encountered. What is clear, however, is that their far-reaching trade routes brought them into contact with some of the most advanced and fascinating civilizations of the ancient world, including Egypt, Greece, and Mesopotamia. These exchanges of goods, ideas, and technologies laid the foundation for the incredible cultural blending that characterized the ancient Mediterranean. As you think about this exchange, you realize just how much the Phoenicians contributed to the spread of knowledge. For example, they were instrumental in the diffusion of the alphabet across the Mediterranean. The Phoenician writing system, which was based on a simple set of symbols representing sounds, was a revolutionary development in the history of communication. It was far more efficient and accessible than the complex pictographs used by the Egyptians or the cuneiform script of the Sumerians, making it easier for people in different cultures to write and record information. Historians still debate how the Phoenician alphabet was adopted by other cultures. Some suggest that it was directly borrowed by the Greeks, who adapted it into their own alphabet, while others argue that the Phoenicians themselves may have spread the alphabet through their widespread trade routes. Regardless of the exact origins, the Phoenician alphabet became the foundation for many modern writing systems, including Greek and Latin, and has had an enduring influence on language and communication. But the Phoenicians didn't just spread writing, they spread technology, too. They were known for their advanced shipbuilding techniques, and many of their innovations in naval architecture were later adopted by other civilizations. Their ships were fast, durable, and capable of navigating the rough waters of the Mediterranean, allowing them to establish a vast trading network. Their use of sails and oars in tandem, combined with their mastery of navigation, made their vessels some of the most advanced of their time. These innovations allowed the Phoenicians to establish themselves as the premier seafarers of the ancient world, and to control the trade routes that connected the Mediterranean's disparate regions. In addition to their technological contributions, the Phoenicians were also responsible for the spread of religious ideas. Their gods and goddesses were worshipped across the Mediterranean, and their religious practices influenced other cultures. One of the most well-known Phoenician gods was Baal, a deity associated with fertility and storms. Baal was widely worshipped in Phoenician cities, and his cult spread to other regions, including Carthage, where he became the central figure in the city's religious life. The Phoenician practice of offering sacrifices to their gods was also adopted by many other civilizations, including the Romans. Historians continue to debate the influence of Phoenician religion on the Mediterranean world. Some scholars argue that the Phoenician gods were the direct predecessors of the gods worshipped by later civilizations, while others suggest that the Phoenician influence on religion was more indirect. However, it's clear that Phoenician religious practices, including their belief in the power of gods to control the natural world, left a lasting mark on the cultures they encountered. As you drift further into the night, you begin to see how the Phoenicians were more than just merchants. They were pioneers in cultural exchange, spreading knowledge, ideas, and technologies across the Mediterranean. Their empire wasn't built on military conquest or territorial expansion. It was built on the exchange of goods and ideas, on creating a network of trade that connected civilizations and allowed them to thrive. The Phoenician legacy is a testament to the power of trade and diplomacy, to the idea that empires don't have to be built on violence or force. Instead, they can be built on cooperation, innovation, and the willingness to adapt to new ideas and cultures. The Phoenicians understood this better than anyone, and their success in creating an interconnected world of commerce and culture is something that continues to inspire us today. In the end, the Phoenicians' empire may have faded, but their influence remains. From the alphabets we use to the ships we sail, from the goods we buy to the ideas we share, the Phoenicians left an indelible mark on history. Their ability to turn trade into an art form, to make commerce a vehicle for cultural exchange, is a legacy that has shaped the world in ways that still resonate today. As the soft lapping of the waves against the Phoenician ship continues, you begin to realize just how integral the sea was to their success. The Phoenicians weren't just good at sailing, they were pioneers in the art of navigation, turning the Mediterranean into their own personal highway. But it wasn't just about trading goods. The Phoenicians understood something critical about human nature. They knew that for their empire to thrive, they needed to make their trade routes as much about relationships as they were about commodities. And they achieved this, in part, by cultivating a reputation for trust, reliability, and innovation. This approach helped them grow from small city-states like Tyre and Sidon into the premier traders of the ancient world. The Phoenicians were the first true merchants, using the sea not just as a means of transport, but as a tool to forge connections with other civilizations. They traveled to Egypt, Greece, and even as far as Britain, establishing trading relationships that spanned the known world. Their ships became symbols of reliability, their merchandise coveted, and their influence unchallenged. But what made the Phoenicians so incredibly effective, it wasn't just the volume of trade or the distance they traveled. No, the real secret to their success was their ability to adapt. The Phoenicians were, above all else, adaptable. Whether it was shifting their trading strategies, adjusting to new markets, or learning from the cultures they interacted with, they were always ahead of the curve. This adaptability allowed them to thrive in a world that was constantly changing, even when other civilizations faltered. Historians still debate whether the Phoenicians were primarily opportunistic, simply taking advantage of favorable conditions in the Mediterranean, or if they were true visionaries who laid the groundwork for global trade. Some suggest the Phoenicians were simply in the right place at the right time, capitalizing on the growing demand for luxury goods. Others argue that the Phoenicians were the ones who created the very systems that allowed long-distance trade to flourish. Either way, their success was undeniable, and their ability to forge relationships with people from all walks of life played a massive role in their rise to power. Take a moment to think about the Phoenician approach to trade. It wasn't just about selling goods. It was about creating partnerships. They understood that trade wasn't just an exchange of products, but a cultural exchange. Through their interactions with Egypt, Greece, and Rome, the Phoenicians were able to bring new ideas, technologies, and even religious practices to the Mediterranean world. Their influence wasn't just limited to material goods, it extended to shaping the way the entire region saw itself. The Phoenicians were also brilliant in their ability to share knowledge. As they traded, they brought with them advancements in technology and manufacturing that were later adopted by other civilizations. One example is glassmaking. The Phoenicians are often credited with the invention of glass blowing, creating delicate and intricate glass objects that became highly prized in the ancient world. Their craftsmanship was so advanced that they influenced glass production in later civilizations like the Romans, who took the Phoenician techniques and further refined them. Historians still argue whether the Phoenicians were the true inventors of glass blowing, or whether they simply refined techniques borrowed from earlier cultures. Some claim that glassmaking existed in Egypt and Mesopotamia long before the Phoenicians, while others believe the Phoenicians were the first to truly master the art. Regardless of its origin, the Phoenicians' contribution to glassmaking had a profound impact on the ancient world, and their innovations would influence the development of glassmaking for centuries. But the Phoenicians didn't just stop at glass. They were known for their textiles as well, particularly the famous Tyrian purple dye, made from the murex snail. The dye was so rare and expensive that only the wealthiest individuals could afford to wear it. The color became associated with royalty and nobility, and owning garments dyed with it was a symbol of status and power. Phoenician merchants understood the appeal of exclusivity, and they used this to their advantage. By controlling the production of Tyrian purple, they essentially monopolized the luxury market of the ancient Mediterranean, ensuring that their goods were always in high demand. Historians still argue whether the Phoenicians were the sole creators of Tyrian purple, or whether other ancient cultures also independently discovered how to create the dye. Some scholars suggest that other civilizations, like the Greeks and Egyptians, had access to the same murex snails and used them for dyeing. Others maintain that the Phoenicians were the true masters of the process, creating a dye that was unmatched in quality and exclusivity. Regardless of who invented it, one thing is clear: Phoenician merchants knew how to take a simple resource and turn it into something incredibly valuable. As you continue your journey on the Phoenician ship, you realize that their success was not just about the goods they traded or the innovations they developed. It was about their ability to build a lasting legacy. The Phoenicians were pioneers of global trade, but they were also cultural brokers, bringing the best ideas, products, and technologies from one civilization to another. They helped shape the ancient Mediterranean into a connected world, and their influence continues to be felt today. Their influence, however, wasn't confined to just material goods or technological advances. The Phoenicians also spread their religious beliefs throughout the Mediterranean, particularly through their colonies. The god Baal, associated with storms, fertility, and the power of nature, was widely worshipped in Phoenician cities and became a central figure in their religious practices. The Phoenician practice of offering sacrifices to their gods, especially Baal, spread to other civilizations, including Carthage, where the cult of Baal became one of the city's defining features. Historians continue to debate the extent of Phoenician influence on the religious practices of other Mediterranean cultures. Some argue that the Phoenicians directly influenced the development of other ancient religions, while others suggest their impact was more subtle Regardless, the Phoenicians played a key role in shaping the religious landscape of the ancient world, spreading their beliefs far and wide as part of their extensive trade network. As you reflect on all that you've learned about the Phoenicians, it's clear that they were more than just traders. They were innovators, diplomats, and cultural architects who helped shape the ancient Mediterranean world in ways that are still felt today. Their ability to adapt to changing circumstances, create valuable products, and forge relationships with other civilizations laid the foundation for the interconnected world we live in. The Phoenician story is one of resilience, creativity, and adaptability, and their legacy continues to inspire and influence the world of trade and commerce. As you gaze into the distance, the shadows of the ancient Phoenician world begin to stretch out before you. You've heard the stories of their great ships, their global trade, and the riches they accumulated from distant lands. But there's something else that sets the Phoenicians apart from the other great civilizations of the ancient world. While their rivals focused on military conquest and territorial expansion, the Phoenicians understood that empire building was about something much subtler: connections. The Phoenicians built their empire not on the strength of their armies, but on the strength of their relationships with others. Their networks of trade were far-reaching, touching cultures across the Mediterranean, and even reaching into Africa and Europe. What's most remarkable about these relationships is how the Phoenicians weren't just interested in trading goods. They were interested in exchanging ideas, sharing technologies, and learning from the civilizations they encountered. Imagine walking through one of their bustling markets, perhaps in Tyre or Carthage. The air is thick with the smell of spices, incense, and freshly dyed fabrics, all woven together in a sensory feast. The sounds of haggling merchants, the laughter of customers, and the hustle of life fill the air. But the real magic happens when you stop and listen closely. Here, the Phoenicians were not only exchanging material goods, they were exchanging cultural wealth. Merchants from Egypt, Greece, and beyond would gather in Phoenician markets, bringing with them stories, technologies, and innovations. In turn, the Phoenicians would offer their own creations, glassware, textiles, and luxury perfumes. Historians still argue whether the Phoenicians' true power lay in their goods or in their ability to connect cultures and create networks. Some believe it was their monopoly on valuable materials, like the purple dye made from the murex snail, that gave them their edge. Others point to their maritime prowess, which allowed them to control trade routes and transport goods more efficiently than anyone else. But there's also the argument that their influence wasn't just about trade. It was about ideas. The Phoenicians understood the power of intellectual exchange, and through their colonies and trade routes, they spread not just products but knowledge. Take, for example, their remarkable contributions to shipbuilding. The Phoenicians were responsible for developing one of the most advanced forms of ancient ship construction, the bireme. This two-rowed ship, with its ability to maneuver and travel long distances, revolutionized ancient seafaring. The Phoenicians didn't just build ships. They built the tools that allowed them to connect the ancient world. Their ships enabled them to establish trade networks that stretched from the Levant to the farthest corners of the Mediterranean. The bireme was so effective that its design was adopted by civilizations across the Mediterranean, influencing naval warfare and trade for centuries. Historians continue to debate whether the Phoenicians were the sole inventors of the bireme, or if other cultures, like the Greeks, contributed to its development. Some believe the Phoenicians refined existing ship designs, while others suggest they were the first to combine oars and sails in such a way. What is clear, however, is that the Phoenicians' innovation in shipbuilding allowed them to establish the longest-lasting and most far-reaching trade empire in the ancient world. They were the first to truly master the seas, creating a system of trade that linked civilizations far and wide. But it wasn't just shipbuilding that set the Phoenicians apart. It was their ability to trade knowledge. While many ancient civilizations focused on expanding their borders, the Phoenicians saw the value in spreading their knowledge of technology, language, and culture. The Phoenician alphabet, one of their most enduring legacies, revolutionized writing across the Mediterranean world. By simplifying the complex scripts used by the Egyptians and Sumerians into a system based on consonants, the Phoenicians made writing more accessible. Their alphabet eventually influenced the development of Greek and Latin writing systems, which in turn became the foundation of modern Western languages. Historians still argue over the origins of the Phoenician alphabet. Some believe the Phoenicians invented it independently, while others suggest they were inspired by earlier systems like Egyptian hieroglyphs. Regardless of its origins, the Phoenician alphabet was an innovative breakthrough that allowed them to communicate quickly and efficiently across their vast empire. This simple, yet highly effective, writing system helped lay the foundation for the spread of literacy and the recording of history in the ancient world. The Phoenicians were also adept at adapting to the needs of their trading partners. They didn't just bring their goods to foreign markets. They adapted their products to suit local tastes and needs. In Egypt, for example, the Phoenicians traded in papyrus and glass. In Greece, they introduced their luxury textiles and perfume. Everywhere they went, the Phoenicians were not just selling their goods, they were exchanging ideas and adapting to the cultures they encountered. This cultural flexibility was a key factor in their success and allowed them to thrive where others faltered. Historians still debate the extent of Phoenician influence on the civilizations they traded with. Some suggest that the Phoenicians were simply opportunistic traders who capitalized on existing markets, while others argue that they were the primary agents of cultural exchange, introducing new technologies and ideas to the Mediterranean. Either way, the Phoenicians left an indelible mark on the ancient world, shaping the course of history through their networks of trade, diplomacy, and cultural exchange. As the Phoenician ship drifts toward the horizon, it's clear that their empire was not built on conquest or military might. It was built on commerce, diplomacy, and the ability to connect people across vast distances. The Phoenicians understood that true power lies in the connections you make, the ideas you share, and the cultures you help foster. Their story is a timeless one, reminding us that the greatest empires are those that build bridges, not walls. As you continue sailing through the quiet waters, the Phoenician Empire still lingers in the air, its influence stretching far beyond the Mediterranean. You begin to see the full picture of their remarkable achievement. Not only did they dominate the seas, but they also revolutionized how the ancient world interacted. The Phoenicians weren't just traders, they were the architects of an ancient global network that connected civilizations in a way that no one else had done before. The more you think about it, the more you realize just how groundbreaking their approach to commerce truly was. They didn't just trade for the sake of accumulating wealth. They connected people. They built relationships with far-flung cultures and brought them into a larger, interconnected world. Their ships weren't just vessels for cargo. They were bridges between worlds, carrying goods and ideas that would shape civilizations for centuries. It's remarkable to consider how little we really know about the Phoenicians compared to other ancient empires. While much of their culture and history has been lost to time, the traces they left behind speak volumes. From the alphabet they created to their innovations in shipbuilding and luxury goods production, the Phoenicians were at the forefront of an ancient revolution. They understood that the future didn't belong to the people who simply conquered lands. It belonged to those who could connect them, creating networks of trade and influence that transcended borders. Historians continue to debate the lasting impact of Phoenician culture. Was their empire truly as influential as it seems, or did it fade quietly into the shadow of the rising Roman Empire? Some scholars argue that the Phoenicians' power was underestimated, overshadowed by the military might of Rome, while others believe that the Romans inherited and built upon the foundations laid by the Phoenicians. Regardless, there's no doubt that the Phoenicians set the stage for the interconnected world we live in today. Consider the Phoenicians' relationship with the Greeks. Their trade routes linked the Greek world to Egypt, Persia, and beyond, facilitating not just the exchange of goods, but of ideas through Phoenician intermediaries. The Greeks were introduced to advanced techniques in shipbuilding, glass-making, and even the concept of alphabetic writing. In fact, the Greek alphabet, which eventually became the foundation for many modern writing systems, was directly influenced by the Phoenician alphabet. Historians still argue over the exact mechanics of this exchange. Did the Greeks directly adopt the Phoenician alphabet? Or did they develop their system independently with some Phoenician influence? Some scholars suggest that the Greeks simply borrowed the Phoenician script and adapted it for their own needs, while others believe that the Phoenicians played a crucial role in spreading writing throughout the Mediterranean world. Either way, the Phoenicians' role in shaping the written word cannot be overstated. Their contributions to literacy, education, and the spread of knowledge were integral to the growth of civilization. But the Phoenician influence didn't stop there. Their relationship with Egypt, for instance, was another crucial pillar of their empire. Phoenician merchants traded goods like cedar, glass, and textiles in exchange for papyrus and grain, two of Egypt's most valuable commodities. These goods weren't just traded for economic reasons. They were exchanged for their cultural value. The Phoenicians understood that to thrive in a global economy, they needed to not only understand trade, but to master cultural exchange. Through these exchanges, the Phoenicians helped foster an atmosphere of intellectual growth and mutual learning. The Egyptians, with their advanced knowledge of astronomy, mathematics, and architecture, influenced the Phoenicians, while the Phoenicians shared their maritime technologies and trade techniques. The result, a flourishing of ideas and innovation that would eventually spread throughout the Mediterranean, creating a hub of cultural exchange that lasted for centuries. Historians continue to argue about the depth of the Phoenicians' influence on ancient Egypt, particularly regarding the spread of knowledge. Some argue that the Phoenicians were simply intermediaries who helped facilitate cultural exchanges between Egypt and other Mediterranean powers. Others believe that Phoenician merchants were actively involved in disseminating knowledge from Egypt, particularly in the fields of mathematics, medicine, and religion. One thing is certain, though: the Phoenician ability to connect civilizations laid the groundwork for the cross-pollination of ideas that fueled the intellectual and technological advancements of the ancient world. The Phoenicians' strategic placement along the coast of modern-day Lebanon also gave them an edge in trade. Not only were they able to access valuable timber, particularly cedar wood, but they also had easy access to the Mediterranean's vast trade networks. Their ports became bustling hubs of commerce, where merchants from across the Mediterranean could exchange goods and ideas. These cities weren't just centers of economic activity. They were also places of cultural exchange, where people from different parts of the world could come together and learn from one another. Historians still debate whether the Phoenician influence was intentional or incidental. Some argue that the Phoenicians deliberately sought to expand their cultural influence, while others suggest that their trading success was simply the result of their proximity to key trade routes and natural resources. Regardless of their intentions, one thing is clear: the Phoenicians didn't just create an empire of goods, they created an empire of knowledge, one that was built on connections, communication, and the exchange of ideas. As you sit back and reflect on this journey through the Phoenician world, you begin to understand the true scale of their influence. They were not just the first great traders of the Mediterranean. They were the first great networkers, the pioneers of cultural exchange. Through their ships, their cities, and their relationships with other civilizations, the Phoenicians helped create a world that was more connected, more open to new ideas, and more in tune with the flow of commerce than ever before. Their story isn't just one of ancient trade. It's the story of how commerce, culture, and collaboration can shape the future as the ship sails into the soft embrace of the night. The Phoenician world continues to reveal its wonders. You've traveled through their markets, their trade routes, and their far-reaching influence, but there's still something about the Phoenicians that sets them apart. Their empire wasn't built on brute force or the conquering of lands. It was built on the quiet, almost invisible threads of trade, culture, and diplomacy that connected the ancient world. At the heart of this network were the Phoenician city-states, Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos. These cities weren't just trading hubs. They were the cultural and economic engines that powered the Phoenician Empire. They controlled some of the most valuable commodities of the ancient world, from the famed Tyrian purple dye to the highly coveted cedar wood of Lebanon. But what made these cities so powerful wasn't just the wealth they accumulated. It was their ability to build trust with foreign powers. They weren't conquerors. They were bridge builders, connecting distant civilizations through trade, diplomacy, and mutual benefit. Historians still argue whether the Phoenicians' success was due to their mastery of trade or their diplomatic savvy. Some believe that their ability to foster alliances and establish colonies gave them a strategic edge over their rivals. Others argue that it was their technological innovations, like their advanced shipbuilding techniques, that allowed them to dominate the Mediterranean. What's clear is that the Phoenicians understood that trade was never just about the exchange of goods. It was about creating lasting relationships that could withstand the test of time. Imagine standing at the bustling port of Carthage, the most famous Phoenician colony. The air is thick with the scents of incense, spices, and scented oils, all commodities traded by the Phoenicians. You can hear the lively chatter of merchants negotiating, the clinking of coins, and the sound of ships being loaded with goods destined for distant lands. The Phoenicians didn't just trade in material goods. They created an atmosphere of exclusivity and luxury that attracted customers from all over the ancient world. They understood the power of branding, and they used it to their advantage. The Phoenicians were pioneers in the art of luxury branding long before it became commonplace. Their purple dye, made from the rare murex snail, was synonymous with wealth and nobility. The glassware they created was finely crafted, delicate, and highly sought after. Their ships, built for both speed and durability, became the symbol of Phoenician reliability. These goods weren't just items to be bought and sold. They were symbols of a lifestyle, a reflection of power, wealth, and sophistication. Historians still debate whether the Phoenicians truly invented the concept of luxury branding, or whether they simply capitalized on the existing demand for high-end goods. Some suggest that they were the first to truly market their products as symbols of exclusivity. Others argue that the demand for luxury goods was already there, and the Phoenicians simply filled it. Either way, one thing is clear. The Phoenicians were ahead of their time in understanding the psychology of commerce and luxury. But beyond their goods and their branding, the Phoenicians' real innovation lay in their ability to establish a global trading network. They weren't limited by borders or geographic constraints. They saw the Mediterranean as a connected world. With each port, each city, a piece of the larger puzzle, the Phoenicians traded not only with the Greeks and Egyptians, but also with distant civilizations, reaching as far as Britain, Spain, and North Africa. Their ships sailed to every corner of the Mediterranean, bringing back precious metals, textiles, and goods from far-flung lands. In return, they exported luxury items, cedar wood, and, of course, the products that made them famous, glass and purple dye. Historians still argue about the Phoenicians' role in the development of early globalization. Some believe that the Phoenicians were the first true global traders, creating the foundations for the interconnected world that would later be built by the Romans. Others suggest that the Phoenicians were simply the first to exploit existing trade routes, not creating a new system, but rather integrating disparate parts of the Mediterranean world into a more efficient network. Regardless of the debate, the fact remains that the Phoenicians were at the center of Mediterranean trade, and their influence extended far beyond their own borders. As you journey further, you can't help but admire how the Phoenicians made their world feel so interconnected. Through their trade routes, their colonies, and their diplomatic efforts, they created a web of relationships that allowed them to thrive for centuries. They didn't rely on military power or territorial conquest. They relied on the power of commerce, Their ships, their goods, and their ideas connected the ancient world in a way that had never been done before. The Phoenicians understood that the future was not about borders or walls, but about connections, collaboration, and exchange. This ability to create an interconnected world was a defining feature of the Phoenician Empire. They were the first to recognize that the key to long-lasting success wasn't just in controlling land, it was in building networks that spanned continents. This insight helped them dominate the Mediterranean world for centuries and allowed them to pass down their legacy to future civilizations. The Phoenicians were truly the first global traders, and their influence can still be seen in the way we do business today. Historians still argue whether the Phoenicians' dominance was the result of innovation or opportunism. Were they truly visionaries, or did they simply capitalize on favorable circumstances? The answer may never be fully clear, but one thing is certain. The Phoenicians' ability to build relationships, adapt, and create networks was the cornerstone of their success. Their legacy is a testament to the power of commerce and connection, and it serves as a reminder that the future isn't just about what we have. It's about how we connect and collaborate with others. As you look out over the calm waters, the Phoenician Empire feels more alive than ever. The ship's sail catches a gentle breeze, carrying you further into the depths of their legacy. You've traveled across the seas, through their markets, and along their trade routes, but there's something about their approach to the world that still holds your attention. The Phoenicians were not just navigators of the seas, they were navigators of culture, of relationships, and of the future itself. When you consider the Phoenicians' empire, what stands out isn't just the sheer scope of their trading networks, or the beauty of their luxury goods. Though those things were certainly impressive, what's most remarkable is the methodical way they approached commerce and connection. In a world where military conquests and territorial expansions were the norm, the Phoenicians understood that the true power lay in creating interdependence, building relationships that linked different people and places through mutual benefit. They didn't just conquer, they engaged. They didn't just rule, they connected. Historians still argue whether the Phoenicians were the first true global traders, or if they were simply opportunists who capitalized on existing trade routes and natural resources. Some argue that their success was more about timing and geography, while others believe it was their ability to adapt and innovate that gave them an edge. Regardless of where historians land on this debate, the fact remains that the Phoenicians were ahead of their time in understanding the nature of trade and cultural exchange. They saw the Mediterranean as a web of interconnected civilizations, each with its own strengths, but all benefiting from the connections the Phoenicians helped create. Take a moment to imagine how the Phoenicians moved across the seas, connecting distant cultures with nothing more than their ships, their knowledge, and their trust. Their ships, sturdy and fast, weren't just transportation vessels, they were tools for connection. Phoenician merchants would set sail, carrying goods from their homeland and bringing back commodities, technologies, and knowledge from far-flung regions. Their ports were bustling hubs of cultural exchange, where different people could meet, share ideas, and learn from one another. The Phoenician approach to trade was one of cultural diplomacy, where relationships mattered as much as goods. You can almost hear the clink of coins and the hum of foreign languages as you walk through the Phoenician markets. The scent of incense, myrrh, and cedarwood fills the air, creating a sensory experience that's as much about creating a certain feeling as it is about the exchange of goods. For the Phoenicians, trade wasn't just about material wealth. It was about creating experiences that drew people in, making them want to buy, trade, and form partnerships that would endure. It was this ability to craft an experience, to create a sense of luxury and exclusivity that helped the Phoenicians dominate the Mediterranean world. Historians still debate the extent to which the Phoenicians consciously created this sense of exclusivity. Some suggest that they were simply fulfilling a demand for luxury goods in the ancient world, while others argue that they deliberately marketed their products as symbols of power and sophistication. What's clear, though, is that the Phoenicians understood the psychology of consumerism long before it became a common concept. They were able to make their products irresistible not just because of their quality, but because of the experience they promised. Their purple dye, for example, became synonymous with wealth and power. The deep, vibrant color made from the murex snail was so rare and labor-intensive to produce that it became a status symbol for royalty and nobility. To wear Tyrian purple was to wear power, to declare oneself as part of an elite class, and the Phoenicians knew this. They didn't just sell purple dye, they sold the idea of it. They knew that what made their products valuable wasn't just the material itself, but the cultural cachet that came with owning them. Their branding was sophisticated, subtle, and highly effective. Historians continue to debate the origins of Phoenician purple dye and its widespread use. Some believe that other civilizations, like the Greeks or Egyptians, had access to similar materials, while others argue that the Phoenicians were the sole creators of this luxury product. Regardless of the exact origins, the fact remains that the Phoenicians were masters of branding, and their influence on the luxury goods market can still be seen today in the way we associate certain products with exclusivity and wealth. As the ship glides smoothly over the waters, you begin to see just how much the Phoenicians shaped the world around them. Their legacy is not just about their ships, their trade, or even their luxury goods. It's about their ability to create systems of exchange that linked people and cultures in ways that were previously unimaginable. Their empire wasn't built on the traditional methods of conquest. They didn't seek to control or subdue. They sought to connect, to build networks that would benefit everyone involved. In many ways, the Phoenicians were the original diplomats. They understood that trade wasn't just about the exchange of goods. It was about building lasting relationships that would endure through cooperation and mutual respect. Their empire, if it could be called that, was one of shared prosperity, where goods flowed freely and cultures learned from one another. They didn't dominate through military force. They dominated through the strength of their connections. Historians still argue whether the Phoenicians' influence waned with the rise of Rome, or whether they continued to have an impact long after their political power had faded. Some suggest that the Phoenicians were absorbed into the Roman Empire, their influence subsumed by Rome's vast military and political dominance. Others argue that the Phoenician way of thinking about trade, commerce, and cultural exchange continued to shape the Roman Empire, which inherited much of the Phoenician infrastructure and ideas. One thing is certain, though, the Phoenicians were the pioneers of global trade, the first to understand that the future of the world lay not in conquering lands, but in connecting them. They were the first to build lasting networks that spanned continents, cultures, and civilizations, and their legacy, built on ships, goods, and relationships, continues to echo through the centuries. As you drift deeper into the history of the Phoenicians, the realization sets in. Their empire was built on far more than just trade routes or luxury goods. The Phoenicians understood something that many other civilizations missed: the power of continuity. While other cultures sought to expand through conquest, the Phoenicians expanded by cultivating a web of interconnectedness. They weren't just merchants, they were the architects of a system of exchange that laid the groundwork for future global trade. This idea of continuity wasn't just about maintaining existing trade networks. It was about sustaining relationships over time. The Phoenicians understood that the key to maintaining their dominance in the Mediterranean wasn't simply having the best goods or the fastest ships, but fostering partnerships that would last for generations. They didn't rely on military might or territorial control to maintain their position in the world. They relied on trust and shared prosperity. When you think about the Phoenician Empire, it's clear that their most valuable resource wasn't their goods or ships. It was their connections. They created a system where people, ideas, and goods could flow freely, and in doing so, They built the very foundation of a connected world. Their success wasn't just about what they traded. It was about how they engaged with the world around them. Whether they were forging alliances with Egypt, establishing colonies in North Africa, or trading with the distant shores of Spain, the Phoenicians created a network of cooperation that stretched across continents. Historians continue to debate whether the Phoenicians were truly the first to create such a global network, or whether they were simply the first to systematize it. Some argue that other ancient cultures, such as the Egyptians or the Sumerians, had already established trade routes, and the Phoenicians simply capitalized on these existing networks. Others believe that the Phoenicians were the first to realize that true power didn't lie in military conquest. It lay in creating lasting and mutually beneficial relationships across vast distances. Either way, their ability to connect distant civilizations was one of the key factors that made their empire so successful. This emphasis on continuity also helped the Phoenicians navigate the challenges of political instability. While other empires were constantly at war to defend their borders, the Phoenicians were able to weather the storms of changing political landscapes by relying on their alliances. When one power rose, the Phoenicians didn't resist it. They adapted. They were flexible, able to integrate new cultures and ideas into their network without losing their core identity. In doing so, they ensured their continued relevance, even as other empires came and went. Take, for example, the rise of Carthage, one of the Phoenician colonies that would go on to rival Rome in power. While Carthage's military prowess and political ambitions eventually brought it into conflict with Rome, its origins as a Phoenician colony reflect the continuity that the Phoenicians had fostered. Carthage was built not on conquest, but on trade and the Phoenician model of commerce. It thrived because it was able to harness the Phoenician tradition of diplomacy and networking. And even as Carthage faced the Roman juggernaut in the Punic Wars, the influence of Phoenician trade practices, diplomacy, and cultural exchange continued to shape its approach to warfare and governance. Historians still argue whether Carthage's rise and eventual conflict with Rome was inevitable, or whether it was a direct result of Phoenician practices. Some suggest that Carthage's military ambitions were at odds with its origins as a trading hub, while others believe that it was the Carthaginian commitment to the Phoenician way of commerce and diplomacy that allowed the city-state to reach such great heights. Either way, it's clear that Phoenician influence persisted in Carthage, even as the Phoenician Empire as a whole faded. What's fascinating about the Phoenician legacy is that it wasn't just about the cities they built or the goods they traded. It was about the infrastructure they created, the trade networks, the cultural exchanges, and the relationships that underpinned their empire. This infrastructure was the real power of the Phoenician world. It wasn't just about individual products. It was about the system of exchange that allowed those products to flow across the Mediterranean and beyond. The Phoenicians weren't the first to trade across long distances, but they were the first to create a system that allowed for continuous interchange. Their ability to make trade a long-term, sustainable endeavor is what set them apart from other civilizations. While other empires sought to conquer and expand through force, the Phoenicians expanded through commerce and communication. Their ships, their markets, their relationships, all of these became part of an intricate system that would eventually give rise to the global trade networks that define the modern world. Historians still debate whether the Phoenicians were the pioneers of global trade, or whether their role was simply as intermediaries in the larger Mediterranean economy. Some suggest that the Phoenicians were the first to recognize that long-distance trade could be a continuous, self-sustaining process. Others argue that the Phoenicians were simply exploiting the growing demand for luxury goods in the ancient world. Regardless of where historians land on this issue, one thing is clear: the Phoenicians were the first to create the foundation for a global economy, one that was built on the idea of interdependence and the exchange of ideas. As you sit back and reflect on the Phoenician legacy, it becomes evident that their success wasn't just about the products they traded or the wealth they amassed. It was about their ability to adapt, connect, and sustain relationships across vast distances. The Phoenicians showed the world that trade was more than just an economic activity. It was a way of building lasting connections between cultures, and it was this ability to create continuity that helped them shape the Mediterranean world and beyond. As the waves continue their gentle rhythm beneath the Phoenician ship, you feel a sense of awe at the magnitude of their empire. It's not just about the ships or the goods, but about something deeper, how the Phoenicians understood the power of connection. While empires rose and fell throughout history, the Phoenicians left behind a legacy that still reverberates today. Their brilliance wasn't just in trading spices or fine textiles. It was in mastering the art of interdependence. Their empire wasn't a traditional empire built on the conquest of lands. It was a network of influence, forged through commerce, culture, and diplomacy. Now, as the night deepens and the stars sparkle overhead, think about how the Phoenicians approached their world. Unlike many ancient civilizations, they didn't seek to control others through force. They recognized that true power didn't lie in military conquest, but in the ability to forge and maintain relationships. The Phoenicians built their empire not on armies or boundaries, but on shared prosperity, trading with anyone who could benefit from what they offered. This unique approach to power allowed them to not only dominate the Mediterranean, but also influence the development of trade and cultural exchange for centuries. Let's go back to those bustling markets in Phoenician cities like Tyre, Sidon, and Carthage. Picture the sensory overload, the vibrant colors of their textiles, the rich scents of incense, perfumes, and spices, and the endless chatter of merchants bartering over valuable goods. It wasn't just a place to exchange goods, it was an experience. The Phoenicians were pioneers in creating a marketplace that appealed to all the senses, and it was this sensory experience that made their goods irresistible. Historians still argue whether the Phoenicians consciously developed this brand of luxury, or whether it was simply a product of their high-quality craftsmanship. Some believe that they intentionally marketed their goods as symbols of wealth and status, while others suggest that demand for such products was already there, and the Phoenicians simply filled it. What's clear, however, is that the Phoenicians knew the psychology of commerce. They understood that people don't just buy products, they buy experiences, and the Phoenician marketplace was built to create an unforgettable experience. The purple dye they produced from the murex snail is one of the clearest examples of their luxury branding. This rare and costly dye became synonymous with royalty and the elite. Only the wealthiest could afford garments dyed in Tyrian purple, and wearing this color was a way of marking oneself as part of an exclusive group. The Phoenicians didn't just sell this dye, they sold status, and that, more than the dye itself, is what made it so valuable. The Phoenicians understood that luxury was about more than just the material. They created a cultural context that made their goods highly sought after. Historians still debate the origins of Tyrian purple, and whether the Phoenicians were the first to discover the process. Some suggest that other civilizations, like the Greeks or Egyptians, had access to the same murex snails, but it was the Phoenicians who perfected the technique and turned it into a lucrative trade. Others argue that the Phoenicians controlled the trade of murex snails, monopolizing the production of the dye, regardless of the exact details. What's certain is that the Phoenicians were masters of luxury goods, and they understood that it wasn't just the product, but the aura surrounding it that created demand. Beyond the luxury goods, the Phoenicians were also innovators in the world of navigation. Their ships, designed for speed and durability, were the backbone of their trading empire. These vessels were more than just tools for transporting goods. They were pioneering technologies that enabled the Phoenicians to connect distant lands. The Phoenicians were skilled shipbuilders, and their ships became the envy of other ancient civilizations. They mastered the sea, allowing them to establish trade routes that stretched across the Mediterranean and beyond. Historians continue to debate the role of Phoenician shipbuilding in their success. Some believe their ships were the primary reason for their dominance, while others argue that it was their trade relationships and cultural exchanges that allowed them to thrive. Either way, there's no doubt that the Phoenicians' mastery of the sea gave them a huge advantage over other civilizations, allowing them to control the flow of goods and ideas across the ancient world. But the Phoenicians didn't just trade goods and ideas, they also exchanged religion. Their gods, particularly Baal, played a key role in their culture, and their religious practices influenced the civilizations they encountered. The Phoenician worship of Baal, associated with fertility and storms, spread to other regions, particularly to their colonies like Carthage. The Phoenicians also had a strong tradition of sacrifices to their gods, which was adopted by some of their neighbors. This spread of religious practices is another example of how the Phoenicians used their trade networks to disseminate their influence. Historians still argue whether the Phoenician religion had a direct influence on the Mediterranean world, or whether it was simply absorbed by other cultures over time. Some suggest that the Phoenicians were the cultural brokers of the ancient world, spreading not just goods but ideas. Others believe that their religious practices were more symbolic than influential, only leaving a trace in the cultures they interacted with. Regardless, the Phoenician impact on ancient religious practices cannot be overlooked, and their cultural exchange was as significant as their economic one. As you sail deeper into the history of the Phoenicians, it becomes clear that their empire wasn't just about wealth. It was about lasting influence. The Phoenicians understood that the key to success wasn't just in conquering lands or controlling trade routes. It was in creating connections. Their legacy is not one of military might or territorial expansion, but of trade, diplomacy, and interconnectedness. The Phoenicians were the first to see the Mediterranean as a network, a system of interdependent cultures that could thrive together. And it is through this network that the Phoenicians' influence continues to resonate today. As the Phoenician ship slices through the quiet waters of the ancient world, the enormity of their achievements becomes clearer. What is most striking isn't just their ability to trade across vast distances, or their role in shaping ancient economies. It's their vision. The Phoenicians saw the Mediterranean not as a series of isolated, disconnected regions, but as a unified network of opportunity and collaboration. They understood that the future wasn't about isolation or territorial control, but about creating a system of interdependent relationships that would span continents, reflecting on their empire. It's evident that the Phoenicians were among the first to recognize the power of connectivity, how the exchange of goods, ideas, and culture could bring people together in ways that had never been seen before. Their approach to commerce was far ahead of its time, and they laid the groundwork for the global economy we know today. The globalization of trade, cultural exchange, and mutual reliance between civilizations can all trace their origins back to Phoenician ingenuity. Take a moment to think about how the Phoenicians crafted these networks. Their ships weren't just vessels for carrying goods. They were the threads that wove together the various cultures of the ancient world. These ships carried more than just textiles, perfumes, and glass. They carried ideas, technologies, and practices that transformed the Mediterranean landscape. The Phoenicians didn't just interact with other civilizations, they influenced them, exchanging knowledge and ideas that would shape the course of history. Historians continue to debate the extent of Phoenician influence, particularly in areas such as shipbuilding, religion, and literacy. Some argue that the Phoenicians were the primary catalysts for Mediterranean trade, while others suggest they were facilitators who helped connect already established cultures. Regardless, their influence on early global trade is undeniable, and their innovative spirit laid the foundation for many of the systems we use today. Their invention of the alphabet, their mastery of navigation, and their pioneering efforts in glassmaking are just a few of the lasting contributions that continue to shape our world. Take, for instance, their alphabet, the Phoenician alphabet, which was the precursor to many modern script. revolutionized writing by simplifying the complex pictographic and cuneiform systems that had been used by previous civilizations. By using a set of phonetic symbols to represent sounds, the Phoenicians created a system that was more accessible and adaptable than anything that had come before. This system would later influence the Greek and Latin alphabets, which in turn would shape the development of modern languages across the world. Historians still argue whether the Phoenicians' alphabet was the product of independent innovation or if it was a result of their contact with other cultures. Some scholars believe the Phoenicians borrowed from Egyptian hieroglyphs or Sumerian cuneiform, while others contend that they developed their own unique system. Regardless of its origins, the impact of the Phoenician alphabet on the ancient world is clear. It was a revolutionary advancement in communication, and its legacy continues in the written languages we use today. But the Phoenicians' influence wasn't limited to their written language. Their understanding of navigation was also unparalleled. The Phoenicians were among the first to develop advanced maritime techniques, allowing them to travel farther and more safely than any other civilization of the time. They developed the bireme, a ship with 2 rows of oars, which was faster and more maneuverable than previous designs. They also mastered the art of using sails and oars in tandem, making their ships highly efficient for both trade and exploration. This maritime prowess gave them a significant advantage over other civilizations, enabling them to create an interconnected trade network that spanned the Mediterranean and beyond. Historians still debate the specifics of Phoenician navigation. Some believe that the Phoenicians were the first to use the North Star for navigation, while others argue that they relied on a combination of landmarks, the sun and the stars. Whatever the exact methods, the Phoenicians' mastery of the seas was unmatched. Their ships weren't just tools of trade. They were vessels of connection, linking the disparate cultures of the Mediterranean and spreading knowledge, goods, and ideas across vast distances. The Phoenicians' ability to trade, connect, and adapt allowed them to establish colonies and trading posts across the Mediterranean. Carthage, the most famous of these colonies, became a powerhouse in its own right, rivaling even Rome at one point. But even as Carthage rose to power, it remained tied to the Phoenician legacy, with its trade routes, its cultural practices, and its economic networks reflecting the Phoenician way of doing business. The Phoenicians didn't just establish colonies. They created systems of exchange that endured long after the fall of their empire. Historians still argue over whether the Phoenician colonies were intentional efforts to expand their empire, or whether they were simply trading posts that grew into full-fledged cities. Some believe that Carthage, for example, was always meant to be an independent power, while others argue that it was initially just a Phoenician outpost that eventually took on a life of its own. Either way, the Phoenician colonies were instrumental in spreading the ideas, technologies, and trade practices that would shape the ancient world. As you think about all the Phoenician contributions, you realize that their legacy wasn't built on military conquest or territorial expansion. Instead, it was built on their ability to connect the world around them, on their ability to see the Mediterranean as a network of opportunities, not boundaries. They were the first to understand that commerce, culture, and relationships were the keys to success, and they used these principles to build an empire that spanned centuries. Today, as you reflect on the global networks we have now, it's clear that the Phoenicians were ahead of their time. Their story isn't just one of ancient trade. It's a story of interdependence, of building connections that transcend borders and link civilizations together. It's a legacy that continues to influence how we connect, collaborate, and create in the world today. As the final stretch of your journey continues, you're struck by how far-reaching the Phoenician Empire truly was. We've explored their trade routes, their innovations, and their relationships with other ancient civilizations. But there's one more remarkable element of their success that is worth exploring: their enduring legacy. The Phoenicians may no longer control the Mediterranean, but their influence can still be seen today in the foundations of modern commerce, communication, and even the way we view the world. The Phoenician Empire didn't just leave behind material wealth. It left behind a blueprint for building a global network. In many ways, the Phoenicians were the first to understand that true power didn't come from military might or territorial expansion. They didn't conquer, they connected. By cultivating relationships, adapting to changing circumstances, and mastering the art of trade, the Phoenicians created a world where goods, ideas, and cultures could flow freely across borders. This understanding of global connection is perhaps one of the most important aspects of the Phoenician legacy. In their time, the world was still deeply fragmented, with civilizations often isolated from one another by geography, language, and culture. Yet the Phoenicians understood that the future would be one of interdependence, a future in which civilizations could thrive not by conquering each other, but by building shared networks of commerce, exchange, and cooperation. The Phoenicians' contribution to global trade cannot be overstated. Through their advanced shipbuilding techniques, they created ships that allowed them to navigate long distances across the Mediterranean and even beyond. But it wasn't just about the ships themselves. It was about how they used these ships to build connections with distant civilizations. Their ability to establish trading colonies and partnerships across the Mediterranean allowed them to control the flow of goods and ideas. From the purple dye that became a symbol of wealth to the luxury glassware they were known for, the Phoenicians understood that the true value of trade wasn't just in the goods themselves, it was in the relationships that those goods represented. Historians still debate the true extent of the Phoenician influence on other civilizations. Some argue that their influence was subtle, with much of their impact felt through the channels of trade they established, while others suggest that the Phoenicians were the driving force behind much of the cultural exchange in the Mediterranean world. Regardless, it's clear that the Phoenicians were cultural brokers, not just trading goods, but fostering mutual understanding between different cultures. Their influence didn't stop with trade. The Phoenicians played a significant role in the spread of the alphabet, which would later evolve into the Greek and Latin scripts we use today. The Phoenician alphabet, with its simple set of phonetic symbols, made writing more accessible and adaptable than the complex scripts used by earlier civilizations. Through their trading relationships, the Phoenicians were able to spread this innovative writing system across the Mediterranean, revolutionizing communication in the ancient world. Today, the Phoenician alphabet is recognized as the foundation of many modern alphabets, a testament to their lasting contribution to human civilization. The Phoenicians also transformed naval warfare and shipbuilding, creating vessels capable of maneuvering through the treacherous waters of the Mediterranean. Their ships were the fastest and most efficient of their time, allowing them to dominate trade routes and later inspire other seafaring civilizations, including the Greeks and Romans. The advancements they made in ship design, such as the development of the bireme, enabled them to move quickly across vast distances, transporting goods and ideas. Even today, the legacy of Phoenician naval innovation can be seen in modern maritime industries. Historians still argue whether the Phoenicians' dominance was more due to their technological innovations or their cultural adaptability. Some scholars suggest that the Phoenicians were the first to recognize the potential of long-distance trade, while others argue that they capitalized on existing networks and simply made them more efficient. Either way, the Phoenicians' ability to adapt, innovate, and build connections was the key to their success, and that success had a profound and lasting impact on the world. As we look at the Phoenician colonies, particularly Carthage, we see how their approach to trade, diplomacy, and cultural exchange shaped the future of the Mediterranean. Carthage, originally founded as a Phoenician trading post, grew into a powerful independent city-state that became a formidable rival to Rome. The story of Carthage's rise and eventual fall is intertwined with the Phoenician legacy. While Carthage's military power brought it into direct conflict with Rome, Its economic and cultural roots in Phoenician trade networks were a significant factor in its success. The Punic Wars, fought between Rome and Carthage, ultimately led to the destruction of Carthage, but the Phoenician influence lived on, shaping the world long after their empire was gone. Today, the legacy of the Phoenicians can still be felt in the globalized world we live in. The concept of trade networks, the sharing of knowledge, and the exchange of goods and culture are all ideas that the Phoenicians pioneered. They were the first to understand the importance of connection and collaboration, not just the exchange of goods, but the exchange of ideas, languages, and technologies. The world we live in, one of interconnected economies, shared cultural influences, and global trade networks, owes much of its structure to the Phoenician vision of a connected world. Historians continue to explore the full extent of Phoenician influence, but it's clear that their innovations and cultural exchanges laid the foundation for much of the modern world. Their ships carried goods and ideas across vast distances. Their alphabet became the basis for modern writing systems, and their ability to build lasting relationships changed the course of history. The Phoenicians may no longer control the Mediterranean, but their legacy of connectivity, adaptation, and trade lives on, shaping the world we live in today. As the voyage through Phoenician history continues, the sense of awe lingers. The Phoenicians, with their ships and their trade, may seem like a distant civilization, but their impact on the world is anything but faded. It's easy to think of them as just traders, sailing from port to port. But as you dig deeper into their story, you realize that the Phoenicians were not simply merchants. They were visionaries. They didn't just trade goods. They crafted a new world order that bridged cultures, economies, and histories across the Mediterranean. Let's take a step back and look at how their trade routes worked. Picture the Phoenician merchant, standing on the deck of a sleek, fast vessel, eyeing the horizon where the coast of a new land waits. These ships weren't just symbols of transport. They were conduits of connection. The Phoenicians had the foresight to realize that by linking distant cultures, they could create a dynamic system of commerce that went far beyond the exchange of physical goods. They built networks of trust, based on mutual benefit and shared knowledge. In this world of interwoven relationships, every transaction was more than just an exchange. It was an act of establishing long-term cooperation. The Phoenician ability to form such enduring trade relationships wasn't accidental. They recognized the value of cross-cultural interaction. They didn't simply ship their goods out to the world. They understood that in the world of ancient commerce, the true wealth was in the exchange of ideas, techniques, and cultural practices. They were cultural ambassadors, bringing new innovations to the Mediterranean and beyond. From the alphabet to shipbuilding techniques, they spread knowledge as much as they did material goods. This ability to mix commerce with culture was key to their dominance. The Phoenician alphabet, which we've discussed before, wasn't just a writing system. It was a tool of communication, one that made possible the rapid exchange of ideas across vast distances. The simplicity of the Phoenician script allowed it to spread easily through the Mediterranean, and eventually to the wider world. It became the bedrock of Western writing systems, influencing the Greek, Latin, and eventually modern alphabets. Historians still debate the origins of the Phoenician alphabet. Some believe the Phoenicians borrowed elements from earlier writing systems like Egyptian hieroglyphs or Mesopotamian cuneiform, while others argue that the Phoenicians developed their alphabet independently, regardless of how it originated. What's clear is that the Phoenician alphabet was a revolutionary step forward in human communication, and its legacy continues to shape the way we write today. Beyond their contributions to literacy, the Phoenicians also left their mark on the world of navigation. Their ships, designed for both speed and cargo capacity, were a technological marvel of their time. They were among the first to navigate by the stars, using celestial navigation to guide them across vast stretches of ocean. This allowed them to expand their trade routes beyond the familiar shores of the Mediterranean, reaching places as far as Britain, where where they sought the valuable tin that was essential for making bronze. The Phoenicians didn't just conquer new territories, they navigated them. They understood that true success in the ancient world didn't come from brute force, but from the ability to move, adapt, and thrive across diverse environments. Their ships allowed them to connect the Mediterranean world in ways that no one else had before. And their mastery of navigation was a key factor in their ability to create such a vast network of trade. As the Phoenician ships set sail from port to port, they carried not just physical goods, but also the seeds of cultural exchange. The Phoenicians didn't simply trade in luxury items like their famous purple dye or glass. They also traded technologies, ideas, and religious practices. They brought with them their religious beliefs, such as the worship of Baal, a god of fertility and storms. These beliefs spread through their trade routes and influenced the cultures they came into contact with. Phoenician religious practices, especially their cult of Baal, would later be adopted by the Carthaginians, one of their most successful colonies. Historians continue to debate the extent of Phoenician religious influence on the Mediterranean world. Some argue that the Phoenicians were merely carriers of religious practices, while others suggest that their religion played a more direct role in shaping the religious landscape of the ancient world. One thing is clear: as the Phoenicians spread their goods across the Mediterranean, they also spread their beliefs, creating a cultural and religious legacy that would influence the region for centuries. The Phoenicians also made significant contributions to glassmaking, a craft that would go on to influence civilizations across the Mediterranean. The Phoenicians were among the first to develop the technique of glass blowing, which allowed them to create intricate glass items that became highly prized by wealthy consumers. The Phoenician ability to manufacture such delicate and beautiful items didn't just make them wealthy, it also made them innovators in the world of art and design. Historians still argue whether the Phoenicians were the first true glass blowers, or whether they borrowed this technique from other cultures. Some believe that glassmaking existed in Mesopotamia or Egypt long before the Phoenicians perfected it. Others argue that the Phoenicians were the true innovators in this field, creating glass products that were unmatched in quality and craftsmanship. Regardless of the origins, the Phoenician legacy in glassmaking was significant, influencing both art and commerce in the Mediterranean world. As you continue to reflect on the Phoenician Empire, it becomes evident that their success wasn't just about goods or trade. It was about their vision. The Phoenicians understood that the key to lasting power was in connections, and they built an empire based on trust, collaboration, and the exchange of ideas. Their ability to adapt to different cultures, to spread knowledge as much as they spread goods, allowed them to create a legacy that would influence civilizations long after their political power had waned. Today, as you sit back and look at the world we live in, one of global trade, cultural exchange, and interconnectedness, it's easy to see the Phoenician fingerprints all around. They were the original globalizers, shaping the ancient world into something that more closely resembles the modern world than we may have realized. Their legacy lives on in the systems of trade, communication, and cultural exchange that define the world we live in today. As the stars above twinkle like scattered gems, you find yourself at the threshold of the final chapter of the Phoenician journey. It's been a long voyage through time, but as the ship drifts onward, the true depth of Phoenician influence begins to sink in. You've seen how they were able to weave an empire not through the sword, but through ships, trade, and diplomacy, how their goods, their ideas, and their innovations connected the Mediterranean and beyond. But what's perhaps most striking about the Phoenician Empire is how their legacy continues to shape the world we live in today. The stories of their cities, their markets, and their ships may feel distant, but they are part of the very foundation upon which modern commerce, culture, and communication stand. Think about it for a moment. The Phoenicians were among the first to establish true global trade routes, spanning from the shores of their native Lebanon to the farthest reaches of Britain and North Africa. Their ships, able to navigate vast distances with unparalleled speed and reliability, were at the heart of this expansive network. They didn't just ferry goods, they connected civilizations, creating a shared space of commerce and cultural exchange. In the same way that modern shipping lanes facilitate global trade, the Phoenician ships facilitated the flow of not just materials, but ideas and innovations that continue to ripple through history. Historians still debate the extent of Phoenician influence on the civilizations they encountered. Some argue that their role in spreading technologies, writing, and religious practices was far greater than what we typically acknowledge. Others suggest that they were simply opportunists who capitalized on existing trade routes. But what's undeniable is that the Phoenicians helped to shape the ancient Mediterranean into a world that was interconnected in a way that hadn't been seen before. They made the Mediterranean feel like a unified space, where goods, culture, and ideas could flow freely across borders. Consider their contribution to navigation. The Phoenicians were known for their advanced maritime technology, particularly their shipbuilding techniques. They were able to craft vessels that were fast, maneuverable, and durable, qualities that gave them a distinct advantage in the Mediterranean. But it wasn't just the ships themselves that were remarkable. It was their understanding of the sea. The Phoenicians were expert navigators, using the stars, the winds, and the sea currents to guide their voyages. This mastery of navigation allowed them to chart courses to distant lands, connecting disparate civilizations across vast distances. Their ships were the catalysts of a new kind of global trade, one where goods and ideas could travel freely across the known world. The Phoenicians didn't stop with just the act of sailing. They revolutionized the way trade was done. Their trading networks weren't limited to just the exchange of goods. They were a mechanism for cultural diplomacy by establishing colonies, forming strategic alliances, and even spreading their writing system. The Phoenicians created long-lasting connections that endured far beyond their political empire. The Phoenician alphabet, for example, was adopted by the Greeks and later by the Romans, laying the foundation for modern Western alphabets. Through trade, they didn't just exchange materials, they exchanged knowledge, technologies, and ideas that helped to create the foundation of Western civilization. Historians still debate the exact origins of the Phoenician alphabet. Some believe that the Phoenicians independently developed their system of writing, while others argue that they were influenced by older scripts, like those of the Egyptians or Mesopotamians. Regardless, the Phoenician alphabet was a game changer, a simple, efficient system of symbols that could be used by different cultures for communication. This innovation made writing accessible to a wider audience and facilitated the spread of literacy and learning across the Mediterranean world. In this way, the Phoenicians didn't just conquer through trade. They helped to build the intellectual foundations of the ancient world. Beyond the alphabet, the Phoenicians' glass-making and textile production were also instrumental in shaping the ancient Mediterranean. They didn't just sell goods, they sold luxury and exclusivity, creating a market for high-end products that would continue to thrive for centuries. The famous purple dye they created from the murex snail became a symbol of wealth and power. While their glass products were highly prized by wealthy consumers across the Mediterranean, the Phoenicians didn't just sell products, they created a brand of luxury that would become synonymous with their name. Historians continue to debate the extent of Phoenician involvement in luxury goods production. Were they the first to introduce these goods, or did they simply capitalize on an existing market? Some suggest that their success in the luxury market was a natural consequence of their control over certain resources, like murex snails or fine glass-making techniques. Others argue that the Phoenicians were innovators in the luxury market, creating demand for goods that had never been seen before. Either way, their influence on the ancient luxury goods market was undeniable, and their legacy continues to shape how we think about luxury and branding today. But it's not just their goods or their innovations that make the Phoenician legacy so enduring. It's the way they built their empire. They didn't conquer through force. They built through connection. Their empire was one of interdependence, where cultures, civilizations, and peoples were linked through trade, diplomacy, and cultural exchange. The Phoenicians didn't just dominate, they created a network of relationships that allowed them to thrive without the need for territorial control. They didn't need to build walls, they built bridges, connecting the ancient world in ways that had never been done before. As you sail through the final stretch of your journey through Phoenician history, you begin to see that the true power of the Phoenician Empire wasn't in their goods or their ships, it was in their vision. They were the first to understand the power of a connected world, where the exchange of goods, ideas, and culture could create a lasting, thriving network. Their legacy is not one of conquest, but of collaboration, of connection, and of innovation. Historians still debate the exact impact of the Phoenicians on the civilizations they encountered. Some argue that their influence was more indirect, while others suggest that they were the driving force behind much of the ancient world's interconnectedness. Whatever the case, the Phoenicians created a legacy that continues to resonate today. The networks they built, the technologies they shared, and the ideas they spread were foundations upon which the modern world was built. As you look out over the horizon, it's clear that the Phoenicians weren't just merchants. They were the first true global citizens, shaping the world in ways that continue to impact us today as the ship continues its steady course. The last echoes of the Phoenician world linger. You realize that, even though their political dominance eventually faded, the Phoenician legacy is still a beating heart in the history of human civilization. They were pioneers in many respects, masters of the seas, innovators in commerce, and architects of an interconnected world. But what stands out the most is their ability to adapt, innovate, and build lasting relationships that have influenced the course of history in profound ways. The more you reflect on the Phoenician Empire, the clearer it becomes that their greatness wasn't just in the physical goods they traded, but in the way they cultivated and nurtured global networks. When most other ancient civilizations focused on territorial control and military conquest, the Phoenicians understood that the future lay in connection. They didn't conquer, they collaborated. They didn't isolate. They integrated, and through this, they created a foundation for the ancient world that would eventually shape the global systems we rely on today. Imagine being part of that world. A Phoenician merchant sailing on a ship built for speed and efficiency, the wind at your back as you glide from one bustling port to the next. Each city you visit, from Tyre to Carthage, is more than just a stop on the trade route. It's a vital part of a much larger network, each node contributing to a system that spans the Mediterranean and beyond. The Phoenicians didn't just trade in commodities, they traded in relationships, trust, and shared knowledge. Their ships were not just tools for transporting goods, they were vessels of connection, bringing together diverse cultures, ideas, and technologies. Historians still debate the extent of the Phoenicians' global influence. Some argue that their role in the ancient world has been underestimated, suggesting that they were the true pioneers of globalization long before it became a concept. Others believe their influence was more subtle, arguing that the Phoenicians were facilitators of trade rather than the creators of it. However, what is clear is that the Phoenician approach to commerce and cultural exchange paved the way for the interconnected world we live in today. One of the most remarkable aspects of Phoenician trade was their ability to adapt to the changing needs of the civilizations they encountered. The Phoenicians weren't just content to trade in the same products year after year. They were constantly innovating, finding new ways to meet the demands of their customers. Take the Phoenician glassware. For instance, originally, glass was an exclusive luxury, but over time, the Phoenicians adapted their techniques to produce a wide range of glass products that could be sold across the Mediterranean. They didn't just rely on one product or one trade route. They understood the importance of diversification, which allowed them to weather economic downturns and keep their trading empire strong. Historians still argue whether the Phoenicians' success in creating a global network was driven by their own ambition or by the opportunities that arose as the Mediterranean world began to connect more closely. Some suggest that the Phoenicians were driven by a clear vision of a connected world, while others believe they simply seized opportunities as they came. Either way, what cannot be denied is that the Phoenicians' ability to adapt to market demands, political shifts, and the ever-changing dynamics of the Mediterranean made them the most successful traders of the ancient world. Think back to their cities, like Tyre, Sidon, and Carthage. These weren't just cities of commerce. They were hubs of innovation and cultural exchange. The Phoenicians built their cities with trade in mind, establishing ports and markets that were specifically designed to facilitate the flow of goods. The streets were lined with artisans creating exquisite goods, luxurious textiles, glass, and pottery that were sold not just to local buyers, but to merchants from all over the Mediterranean. These cities became the beating heart of the Phoenician Empire, and their influence spread far beyond the walls of their cities, affecting cultures and economies thousands of miles away. Historians continue to debate the role of Carthage in Phoenician trade. Some believe that Carthage was always meant to be an independent power, while others argue that it was originally a Phoenician trading post that eventually grew into a city-state of its own. Regardless, it's clear that Carthage was a reflection of Phoenician ingenuity, built on the foundations of trade, diplomacy, and cultural integration. The city-state thrived because of its connections with other civilizations, particularly through its relationships with Carthaginian colonies in North Africa and beyond. And yet, the Phoenicians' influence wasn't only about the trade of physical goods. They were also responsible for the spread of ideas, from their religions to their alphabet. Their alphabet was revolutionary, turning writing from a complex system of pictographs to a phonetic script that could be easily adapted by other cultures. The Phoenician alphabet eventually became the foundation for Greek, Latin, and many modern languages. This simple, yet powerful, writing system is just one example of how the Phoenicians helped to shape the intellectual landscape of the ancient world. Historians still debate whether the Phoenicians were the sole creators of the alphabet, or whether it was the result of a combination of influences from other cultures. Regardless of its origins, the fact remains that the Phoenicians were the masters of communication in the ancient world. Their ability to create a universal script helped facilitate communication across vast distances, allowing them to establish a system of global trade that was unprecedented at the time. As you reflect on all that the Phoenicians accomplished, you begin to see that their empire wasn't just built on trade and goods. It was built on connections that brought together cultures, ideas, and technologies in a way that had never been done before. The Phoenicians were the pioneers of the interconnected world, and their legacy is one that continues to shape how we interact with the world around us. Their ships may have sailed into history, but the networks they created, the connections they forged, and the ideas they shared still echo in the modern world. As you sail deeper into the Phoenician past, you begin to realize the extent of their influence on the ancient world. The Phoenicians were not just merchants. They were global pioneers, laying the groundwork for the systems of commerce, communication, and culture that continue to shape our world today. Their mastery of the seas, their innovative approach to trade, and their ability to build lasting relationships set them apart from other ancient civilizations. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about the Phoenicians was their vision, a vision that extended far beyond the borders of their own cities, creating a network of interwoven connections that spanned continents. As you stand at the helm of this journey, the vastness of Phoenician influence becomes clear. Their trade routes, which stretched across the Mediterranean, weren't just about the exchange of goods. They were about building systems of exchange that connected different peoples and cultures. The Phoenicians understood that commerce, at its core, was about more than material wealth. It was about creating a shared world where ideas, cultures, and technologies could be exchanged freely. Imagine walking through the streets of a Phoenician port, perhaps in Tyre or Carthage. The air is filled with the scents of spices, perfumes, and incense, products of Phoenician trade that have traveled from distant lands. The streets are alive with the sound of merchants haggling over glassware, textiles, and luxury items. But beneath the bustling market, something deeper is at work. The Phoenicians weren't just selling goods. They were building relationships, forging bonds between cultures that would last for generations. These relationships, based on mutual benefit and shared prosperity, were the true foundation of Phoenician success. Historians continue to debate the extent of Phoenician influence in the ancient Mediterranean. Were they the primary cultural brokers, responsible for spreading ideas and technologies, or were they simply opportunistic traders who capitalized on an existing system of exchange? Some argue that the Phoenicians were instrumental in the spread of alphabetic writing, while others suggest that their role was more subtle, helping to facilitate trade between already established civilizations. Regardless of the debate, one thing is clear: the Phoenicians were masters of connection, and their ability to weave together a vast network of trade and diplomacy is a defining feature of their legacy. Take, for instance, the Phoenician alphabet. This seemingly simple system of phonetic symbols revolutionized communication in the ancient world. Before the Phoenicians, writing systems were complex and often inaccessible to the average person. The Phoenician alphabet, by contrast, was simple, efficient, and easy to adopt. This made it possible for people across the Mediterranean to communicate with one another, laying the groundwork for the development of literacy and the spread of knowledge. The Phoenician alphabet eventually influenced the Greek and Latin alphabets, which became the foundation for most modern writing systems. Historians still debate the origins of the Phoenician alphabet. Was it an original invention, or was it influenced by earlier writing systems? Some scholars suggest that the Phoenicians were inspired by Egyptian hieroglyphs or Mesopotamian cuneiform. Others argue that the Phoenician alphabet was a completely independent creation. Regardless of its origins, its simplicity and adaptability made it a catalyst for communication, and its influence can still be seen in the way we write today. In addition to their innovations in writing, the Phoenicians were also masters of maritime technology. Their ships were the backbone of their trade empire, allowing them to travel long distances and establish trading posts and colonies across the Mediterranean. The Phoenicians were pioneers in navigation, using the stars and the winds to guide their ships across vast distances. This made them not only the most skilled sailors of their time, but also the most successful traders. Their ships were fast, reliable, and able to carry large amounts of goods, allowing them to establish global trade networks that were unrivaled in the ancient world. Historians still argue whether the Phoenicians' shipbuilding techniques were truly revolutionary, or whether they simply built upon the knowledge of other seafaring cultures. Some suggest that the Phoenicians borrowed from the Egyptians or the Greeks, while others argue that they were the true innovators of ancient shipbuilding. Regardless of the debate, their vessels were among the most advanced of their time, and their navigation skills allowed them to connect distant civilizations, facilitating the exchange of goods, ideas, and technologies. The Phoenicians didn't just build ships, they built networks. Their ability to establish colonies and trading posts across the Mediterranean created a vast web of interconnected cities, each playing a role in the broader Phoenician trade system. From Carthage in the west to Byblos in the east, Phoenician cities were linked by a system of shared commerce and cultural exchange. These cities didn't just exchange goods, they exchanged ideas, technologies, and religious practices. The Phoenicians were the first to recognize the importance of cultural diplomacy, understanding that true power didn't come from military conquest. It came from creating a world where ideas and goods flowed freely. Historians continue to debate the Phoenicians' role in the spread of religion. Some argue that they were instrumental in spreading Canaanite religious practices across the Mediterranean, particularly the worship of Baal, a fertility god. Others suggest that their religious influence was more symbolic, with Phoenician gods and rituals being absorbed by other cultures over time. Regardless of the specifics, it's clear that the Phoenicians were cultural catalysts, spreading not just material goods but ideas, beliefs, and customs throughout the Mediterranean world. As the journey through Phoenician history comes to a close, it's clear that their empire wasn't just about commerce or culture. It was about connection. The Phoenicians understood that the key to lasting success was in building relationships, in creating a network of interdependence where trade, culture, and ideas could flow freely across borders. Their legacy lives on today in the globalized world we live in, one built on networks of commerce, communication, and connection. As you sail onward, the depths of the Phoenician influence seem to extend farther into the past than you ever imagined. The Phoenicians, though they are often remembered as merchants and traders, were the architects of an ancient, interconnected world, one that would influence the course of history far beyond their time. Their legacy is everywhere, woven into the fabric of modern civilization in ways we often overlook. The Phoenicians laid the groundwork for global trade, cross-cultural exchange, and technological innovation, and their impact can still be felt in our lives today. Looking back at their cities, Tyre, Sidon, and Carthage, it's clear that the Phoenicians were masters of urban planning. They built their cities not just as centers of commerce, but as hubs of interactions. These cities were designed for trade, but they were also designed for cultural exchange. Merchants and travelers from all corners of the ancient world passed through these cities, bringing with them new ideas, technologies, and beliefs. The Phoenician cities were truly melting pots, where goods and ideas were exchanged just as freely as the products they traded. Historians still debate how much of Phoenician civilization was a direct result of the cultures they interacted with, and how much was uniquely Phoenician. Were the Phoenicians truly the pioneers of global trade and cultural exchange? Or were they simply opportunistic traders who capitalized on existing systems? Some scholars suggest that the Phoenicians were the first to recognize the value of interconnected trade, while others believe they were simply building upon older trade routes established by earlier cultures. Regardless of their origins, the Phoenicians perfected what others had only begun to understand. They turned trade into a global network, creating relationships and building infrastructure that would last for centuries. One of the most fascinating aspects of Phoenician trade was their ability to adapt. The Phoenicians didn't just sell the same goods over and over. They understood the evolving demands of the ancient world and adjusted their strategies accordingly. They weren't afraid to innovate, whether it was in shipbuilding, glass making, or the development of luxury goods. They adapted to the cultures they interacted with, learning from each civilization and incorporating the best of what they encountered into their own practices. This adaptability allowed them to stay ahead of the curve in a world where success often depended on the ability to change and evolve. Take, for instance, their glassmaking skills. The Phoenicians are often credited with developing the technique of glass blowing, which allowed them to create intricate and delicate glass items that became highly prized in the ancient world. But they didn't just stop there. They adapted their techniques, creating products that could be sold to a wide range of consumers, from the elite to the everyday person. Phoenician glassware was not just about craftsmanship. It was about creating demand. They understood that luxury products needed to appeal to the tastes of the wealthy, while simpler versions could be made to cater to the broader market. This ability to adapt to different customer needs ensured their dominance in the glass trade for centuries. Historians continue to argue about the origins of Phoenician glassmaking. Some believe that the Phoenicians were the first to invent glass blowing, while others suggest that they learned from other cultures, like the Egyptians or Mesopotamians. Either way, the Phoenician contribution to glassmaking had a profound impact on the ancient world. Their techniques were later adopted by the Romans and other cultures, and the art of glassmaking would go on to influence the production of glass in the modern world. The Phoenicians also revolutionized the production of luxury textiles. They are most famous for their production of Tyrian purple, a dye made from the murex snail that was prized for its rich color and rarity. This dye became a symbol of wealth and power, and the Phoenicians controlled its production and distribution. But again, it wasn't just the dye itself that made it so valuable. It was the context in which it was sold. The Phoenicians knew that luxury goods weren't just about the material. They were about creating an experience. Wearing a Tyrian purple garment wasn't just about color. It was about status, sophistication, and the desire to be part of an exclusive group. The Phoenicians understood the psychology of luxury marketing long before the term even existed, and their success in the luxury goods market became a defining feature of their empire. Historians still argue whether the Phoenicians were the first to monopolize the purple dye trade, or whether other cultures had access to the same resources. Some believe the Phoenicians were the first to recognize the commercial potential of the murex snail, while others suggest that they simply capitalized on an existing market. Regardless of their role in its invention, the Phoenicians' dominance of the luxury dye trade was unparalleled, and their influence on the luxury goods market can still be seen today. As you reflect on the legacy of the Phoenicians, it's clear that they were more than just merchants. They were innovators who understood the importance of connections, adaptability, and cultural exchange. They created a world in which commerce and culture weren't separate. They were interwoven, each influencing the other. Their ships, their trade routes, their goods, and their ideas helped to create a Mediterranean world that was more interconnected than ever before. In many ways, the Phoenicians were the first globalizers, and their influence still ripples through our world today. From the way we trade to the way we communicate, the Phoenicians laid the foundation for the globalized systems that define the modern world. Their legacy is one of connection, innovation, and interdependence, and it serves as a reminder that the future isn't just about territorial expansion or military power. It's about building networks, creating connections, and embracing the exchange of ideas and cultures. The Phoenicians may no longer sail the seas, but their network of trade, communication, and ideas continues to shape the world we live in today. As the journey through Phoenician history nears its end, you find yourself reflecting on just how ahead of their time the Phoenicians really were. What began as a group of coastal city-states in the eastern Mediterranean evolved into one of the most influential networks of the ancient world. The Phoenicians mastered the art of adaptation, connection, and cultural exchange in ways that few others could match. Their empire wasn't one built on military conquest or territorial control, but on their ability to create global trade routes and lasting relationships that spanned across continents. What's most fascinating about their legacy is how interwoven their trade practices were with their understanding of human connection. They weren't just trading commodities, they were building bridges between diverse cultures and people. The Phoenicians saw the Mediterranean as a series of interconnected communities rather than isolated entities, and their entire way of life was built on that belief. Every port, every trading post, and every colony they established was a node in a vast network of commerce, culture, and communication. They understood that their success depended not just on what they traded, but on how they connected with the world around them. Reflecting on their ships, their glassware, and their luxury textiles, it's easy to see how the Phoenicians became the ultimate masters of global commerce. But their true genius wasn't in the goods they traded. It was in their ability to make those goods desirable, in the way they created a market where the luxury of exclusivity and the promise of rare goods set them apart. Whether it was the vivid purple of their famous dye, the delicate beauty of their glass, or the superior craftsmanship of their textiles, the Phoenicians understood that luxury wasn't just about the material, it was about the experience it offered. Take a moment to imagine the bustling markets of Phoenician cities. The streets are alive with the sound of haggling merchants, foreign traders, and customers from all walks of life. The scent of spices, incense, and freshly woven fabrics fills the air. Every corner of the marketplace is a sensory delight, with vendors selling goods that have traveled thousands of miles. You can almost taste the exclusivity of the goods they're selling. The silk from distant lands, the rare metals from Africa, the fragrant perfumes that capture the essence of the ancient world. The Phoenicians understood that commerce wasn't just about exchanging goods. It was about creating a feeling, a desire, and a sense of connection that would last far beyond the transaction. This ability to market not just goods, but lifestyles and experiences is one of the defining features of the Phoenician approach to commerce. The purple dye, for example, wasn't just a commodity, it was a symbol. Wearing Tyrian purple didn't just mean you had fine clothing, it meant you were part of the elite, a member of an exclusive group. The Phoenicians knew how to sell status, and in doing so, they created a market that transcended borders and cultures. This focus on creating exclusivity and luxury wasn't limited to their own society. It helped to define their relationships with the cultures they traded with. From the Egyptians to the Greeks to the Romans, historians still argue whether the Phoenicians invented the concept of luxury marketing or whether they simply capitalized on the existing demand for rare and high-quality goods. Some believe that their success was due to their early recognition of a growing market for luxury, while others argue that they perfected the concept over time. Either way, the Phoenicians were unparalleled in their ability to craft products that were not only functional, but also symbolic of wealth and sophistication. They weren't just selling textiles or dyes. They were selling an idea, an experience that spoke to the desires and aspirations of their customers. But the Phoenicians didn't just trade luxury items. They were also responsible for spreading knowledge, from the art of shipbuilding to the science of navigation to their revolutionary alphabet. The Phoenician alphabet, with its phonetic system of writing, laid the foundation for the Greek and Latin alphabets and influenced modern writing systems. It was a gift of communication to the world, allowing ideas, stories, and knowledge to travel more easily across the Mediterranean. The Phoenicians were the unsung heroes of the written word, helping to create the foundation of modern literacy. The Phoenicians' contributions to maritime technology were just as significant. Their ships, crafted for both speed and cargo capacity, were the backbone of their trade empire. The bireme, a ship with 2 rows of oars, was one of their most famous innovations, allowing them to sail faster and more efficiently than their competitors. The Phoenicians were also pioneers in the use of sails and oars together, a technological breakthrough that gave them an edge on the seas. These advancements made the Phoenicians the best sailors of their time and allowed them to dominate Mediterranean trade for centuries. Historians continue to debate the true origins of Phoenician shipbuilding techniques. Some argue that the Phoenicians were the first to combine sails and oars effectively, while others suggest that they borrowed techniques from other seafaring cultures. What's clear, however, is that Phoenician ships were among the most advanced of their time, and their maritime innovations set the stage for the great naval empires that would follow, including Rome. The Phoenicians weren't just about trade. They were about connection. They saw the world not as a collection of isolated societies, but as a vast, interconnected network, where the flow of goods, ideas, and culture was the key to success. They were the first true globalizers, and their empire was built on their ability to connect the Mediterranean world in ways that had never been done before. Their legacy lives on today in the global systems of trade, communication, and cultural exchange that shape our modern world. As you come to the end of this journey, it's clear that the Phoenicians weren't just the first great traders. They were the first great connectors. Their empire wasn't defined by military conquest or territorial expansion. It was defined by their ability to build relationships, create networks, and bridge cultures. And it is through this legacy of connection that the Phoenicians left an indelible mark on history. As the final stretches of the journey unfold, you begin to understand just how profound the Phoenician legacy truly is. The waves are calm, the night is deepening, and the weight of history sinks in. The Phoenicians may have vanished from the world stage centuries ago, but their influence remains, woven into the very fabric of modern civilization. Their ships, their goods, their networks, they were all part of a system that brought the ancient world closer together and laid the foundation for the world we live in today. The Phoenicians understood that true power didn't come from military conquest, nor from controlling vast swathes of land. Their empire was built on a different principle: connection. They didn't conquer territories. They built relationships through trade, diplomacy, and cultural exchange. The Phoenicians created a network of cities, colonies, and markets that connected the Mediterranean like never before. And this network didn't just benefit the Phoenicians, it benefited everyone who came into contact with it. They didn't just exchange goods, they exchanged ideas, technologies, and cultures. In many ways, the Phoenicians were the first globalizers, pioneers of a system of commerce and connection that continues to shape our world today. The trade routes they established across the Mediterranean formed the backbone of the ancient economy, linking people and cultures from Egypt to Spain, from Africa to the Near East. Through their innovative shipbuilding, their mastery of navigation, and their entrepreneurial spirit, the Phoenicians opened the doors to a connected world, one where goods, ideas, and cultures could travel freely across vast distances. Reflect on the Phoenician marketplace again. Imagine stepping into the bustling markets of Carthage, where merchants from all corners of the Mediterranean have gathered, each offering goods from far-flung lands. There is the sweet, fragrant scent of incense and spices, the dazzling display of textiles in every color imaginable, and the distinct sound of haggling as deals are struck. But as you walk through this market, you realize that it isn't just the goods being exchanged. It's the stories, the technologies, the cultures, and the beliefs. The Phoenicians understood that the exchange of goods was only part of the equation. The real value came from the relationships they built along the way. Historians still argue whether the Phoenicians were the true masters of globalization, or whether they were simply opportunistic traders who capitalized on an existing system. Some argue that they were the first to recognize the potential of a global network of trade, while others suggest that they were just in the right place at the right time. Regardless of the debate, one thing is clear: the Phoenicians didn't just establish trade routes, they established connections, and these connections helped shape the ancient Mediterranean world, creating a network of interwoven cultures, ideas, and economies. The Phoenicians' greatest gift to history wasn't just the luxury goods they traded, like the famed Tyrian purple dye or the glassware they produced. It was their ability to create a world where trade wasn't just about selling products. It was about building lasting relationships that could endure across generations. They understood that the exchange of goods was only the surface of a much deeper and more powerful exchange: the exchange of trust, culture, and innovation. In doing so, they laid the foundation for the global economy that would emerge centuries later. As you look at the global systems that govern commerce today, whether in shipping, finance, or communication, you can see the Phoenician influence at work. From the creation of global trade routes to the spread of writing systems, the Phoenicians were at the forefront of creating the systems that would allow civilizations to thrive in a connected world. Their alphabet was the foundation for the writing systems of the Greeks, the Romans, and eventually the Western world. Their shipbuilding techniques became the model for naval powers that would follow, from the Greeks to the Romans, and their mastery of maritime navigation allowed for the movement of goods and people across the Mediterranean. The Phoenicians didn't just leave behind material wealth, they left behind ideas, practices, and connections that continue to shape the world today. The legacy of their trading empire lives on in the globalized economy we live in, where goods and services flow freely across borders, where cultures intersect and influence each other, and where ideas are exchanged across continents. The Phoenicians, with their ships, their markets, and their willingness to adapt to new ideas, were the first to create a truly global network. Now, as you come to the end of this journey, you realize that the Phoenician story is not just a story of ancient trade. It's a story of innovation, adaptation, and connection. It's the story of a civilization that recognized the power of relationships and used those relationships to create an interconnected world. They weren't just traders, they were builders of a network that would eventually shape the course of human history. As the night draws on and the ship sails into the horizon, you're left with the realization that the Phoenicians' influence isn't just a thing of the past, it's a living legacy, still present in the way we communicate, trade, and connect with one another. They may have sailed into history, but their legacy continues to guide and shape the world we live in today. And perhaps, in their ability to build connections, the Phoenicians understood something we've all forgotten. The future is never about conquering lands or accumulating wealth. It's about how we connect, collaborate, and share what we have with one another. Thank you for the opportunity to guide you through this journey into the Phoenician world. Sweet dreams, and I hope the story of their legacy continues to resonate with you long after the journey ends. If you ever wish to embark on another adventure, I'm here, ready to set sail again.